I wasn't planning on staying out there that long. The trip was supposed to be short, just a few days away from everything. I had taken time off work for the first time in over a year. My job had started to wear me down. Slowly. It wasn't anything out of the ordinary, just the usual office stress, staring at screens too long, hearing phones ring nonstop. After a while, all of that starts to crawl into your bones, and the only thing that seemed to help was being outside, far from buildings, cars, people. I found the cabin online. It looked like it hadn't been updated in years, which was fine with me. I didn't want some luxury vacation rental. I wanted something quiet, something simple. The pictures showed an old wooden structure set deep into the forest. No Wi-Fi, no reception, no TV, just a wood stove, a bed, and a few shelves with basics. It was perfect. I drove up early on a Tuesday morning. It took a little over 4 hours, and the last 30 minutes were rough dirt roads winding through thick trees. The kind of road where you have to slow down to a crawl just to avoid losing a tire. I passed no other cars, no other cabins, just a whole lot of trees and rock. Once I finally got there, I turned off the car and just sat for a moment. It was dead quiet, not the kind of quiet you get in the suburbs at night. This was a heavy, thick quiet. No distant sounds, just the forest breathing around me. The cabin was smaller in person. The wood looked even older, darker than the pictures. The porch sagged a little in the middle, and the front door stuck when I opened it. Inside, it smelled like pine and old smoke. There were 2 rooms. The front was a combined kitchen and sitting area with a table, some old chairs, a counter with chipped enamel, and a rusty wood-burning stove in the corner. The back room had a bed with a lumpy mattress, a dresser, and a tiny bathroom with a compost toilet and a cracked mirror. It was exactly what I needed. I unloaded the food I brought, canned stuff mostly, some protein bars, trail mix, a few gallons of water. The cabin had no fridge or electricity, so I kept things simple. There was a pump well outside that supposedly worked, but I didn't trust it much. I had a headlamp, some lanterns, my pocket knife, a compass, a map, and my backpack. I had packed light but practical. The first day went by easily. I walked a few trails near the cabin, just stretching my legs and taking in the air. The trees were tall and packed tight, the forest floor soft with fallen pine needles. I didn't see anyone or hear anything that made me uneasy, just wind and the occasional rustle from squirrels or birds overhead. I made a fire that night in the stove and sat near it for hours, reading a book until the pages started to blur. I went to bed before 9 p.m. and slept better than I had in months. It was the second night when things changed. That morning had been clear, and I'd taken a longer hike, maybe 5 or 6 miles out. I followed an old path that twisted around a small hill and opened into a flat clearing with tall grass. There was something peaceful about standing there alone. Nothing man-made in sight, just me and the wind moving across the open field. I stayed out for hours, only heading back when the light began to fade. When I returned, I noticed something strange. The cabin door was slightly open. I had been sure I locked it. I always lock things. I stood there for a full minute, staring at the crack between the door and the frame, trying to figure out if maybe it was the wind. But the air had been still all day. I stepped forward slowly, my hand resting on the handle of my pocket knife. I pushed the door open the rest of the way and stepped inside. Nothing looked out of place at first. The food was still where I left it. My sleeping bag was still rolled on the bed. But something felt wrong. I couldn't put a name to it. Maybe it was just that gut feeling that something had been moved slightly, something too small to notice but enough to throw off the balance. I checked the windows, all shut. I checked the back door, still locked from the inside. I even looked under the bed like a nervous kid. Nothing. I tried to tell myself maybe I hadn't latched the door properly when I left. It was old after all. That night, it took longer to fall asleep. I kept waking up to tiny sounds. One time it was a crack outside the cabin, like a twig snapping. Another time it was the wind moaning through the trees. But then, around 2 in the morning, I heard footsteps. They weren't close. At first, they were far off, crunching slowly over leaves and brush. I lay in bed frozen, trying to figure out if I was dreaming. But the sound kept going steady, slow, getting closer. Not a deer, not a raccoon. It had weight to it, a two-legged pattern. Person. I got out of bed as quietly as I could and crouched near the stove. I had left the lantern burning low, just enough to see by. The footsteps stopped just outside the cabin. No knock, no voice, just silence. I waited, barely breathing. Minutes passed. I didn't move. I didn't dare look out the window. My heart was beating so hard I thought it would give me away. Then, just as slowly, the footsteps started again, moving away this time. I waited for almost an hour before I dared to look outside. There was nothing but darkness and trees. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. The next morning, I stepped out and checked the area around the cabin. I found the tracks. They were clear boot prints in the dirt. Not mine. Bigger. Heavier. Someone had been standing just a few feet from the door for a long time. I packed my bag quickly. I was ready to leave. I even started the car. But the road was so narrow and winding that turning around was a slow, careful process. And deep down, a part of me told myself maybe it had been a hunter. Maybe they were just passing through. Maybe they saw the cabin and didn't realize it was rented. Maybe. I stayed one more night. I shouldn't have. That evening, I set up makeshift alarms. Empty cans tied with string, some fishing lines stretched across the path. Anything that might make a sound if someone got close. I didn't light a fire. I didn't read. I sat in the dark with my knife, watching the windows. Around midnight, the cans clinked. Not loudly, but enough. I stood up, holding my breath, and moved toward the window. I didn't see anyone, but the hair on my arms stood up. I knew someone was out there. I crouched by the bed and waited. Then one of the windows creaked. Not opened, just pushed slightly, the old wood groaning. I stayed perfectly still. Then I saw the shadow pass by. It was fast, but it was there. Someone walked past the window, just inches away from the glass. That was it. I didn't care how late it was. I grabbed my bag and got out of there. I sprinted to the car, started it up, and drove. The tires hit rocks, the bottom scraped dirt, but I didn't slow down. I didn't care. After about 10 minutes, I looked in the rearview mirror. There was a figure standing in the road. I didn't stop. I didn't even blink. I drove for hours until I reached the first gas station. It was closed, but I parked in the lot and waited until daylight. When I got home, I filed a report with the rental site. They brushed it off, said no one else had reported anything. I called the local sheriff's office. They said they'd check it out. I never heard back. A week later, I got a message. No sender, no return address, just a folded piece of paper slipped under my apartment door. It said, in rough handwriting, "Next time, don't leave your trail." I moved 2 weeks after that. I've never gone back to the woods. I don't hike anymore. I don't camp. I live in a city now, surrounded by people, lights, noise, things that used to annoy me but now feel like protection. I don't know who it was. I don't know if it was just one person or more. I don't know if they followed me or if they were already out there. What I do know is that cabin wasn't as empty as it looked, and whoever was watching me knew the land better than I ever could. It wasn't a ghost. It wasn't a creature. It was just a man, or maybe a few, but that's what makes it worse, because people don't vanish into thin air. They hide, and some of them wait. I don't plan on giving them a second chance. It was late September when I decided to take a short break from everything. Work had been stressful. My phone never stopped buzzing, and even on weekends I found myself staring at screens. I needed quiet. I needed space. A few years ago, I had rented a remote cabin deep in the woods of northern Idaho. It was surrounded by thick forest, sat beside a lake, and had no cell signal. That memory stuck with me, so I looked it up and booked it again. It was the kind of place where the silence felt alive. I packed my truck with the basics: dry food, canned meals, a cooler with some meat, water, tools, clothes, and a sleeping bag. I brought a hunting knife and a small pistol just in case. Not because I was expecting trouble, but because I was heading somewhere far from help. I didn't tell many people I was going, just my brother and a friend. It was supposed to be 4 days, maybe 5. The drive took about 8 hours. The last two were on bumpy dirt roads that twisted through miles of forest. I only saw one other vehicle, a parked pickup near a trailhead. I reached the cabin around 4 p.m. It looked the same as before, small, wooden, with a green metal roof. It had one main room with a bed, a small table, a stove, and a single window facing the lake. There was a shed out back with firewood and tools. The place ran on propane and had a small generator, but I didn't plan to use it much. The first evening was peaceful. I made a fire in the pit outside, heated some soup, and sat watching the sky change. No cars, no sirens, no notifications, just the sound of wind and water. That night, I slept better than I had in months. The second day, I hiked around the lake, followed a trail that looped through the woods, and returned by early afternoon. I found animal tracks, deer, maybe a coyote, but nothing unusual. I saw a few birds and one distant moose. Later, I fished a little, though I didn't catch anything. The sky started clouding over that evening. By night, it rained steadily. Rain lasted through the next morning. I stayed inside, made coffee, read an old paperback, and watched the water run down the window. I liked it. The isolation was working. My shoulders felt lighter, but something shifted that night. Around 1 a.m., I woke up suddenly. I didn't know why. It wasn't loud, but something felt off. I lay still, listening. The rain had stopped. The cabin was quiet, too quiet. Then I heard it. Faint movement, like leaves or branches shifting. I told myself it was wind or maybe an animal. Still, I stayed awake a while, just staring at the ceiling. The next morning, I found fresh boot prints near the edge of the lake. They weren't mine. I checked. The shape and tread were different. They led from the waterline into the trees. No prints coming back. I felt a chill in my stomach. This cabin was supposed to be isolated. The nearest structure was miles away. I tried to shake it off, told myself it could have been old, maybe from someone passing through days ago. Still, I grabbed my pistol and kept it close. That day, I stuck near the cabin, gathering more wood and keeping an eye on the treeline. The woods felt different, like they were watching me back. I can't explain it better than that. It was a tightness in my chest, a sense that I wasn't as alone as I thought. That night, I made sure the door was locked. I closed the shutters, something I hadn't bothered doing before. I sat up late, watching the dark from inside. Nothing happened, but I barely slept. The fifth morning, I walked the edge of the lake again. The boot prints were gone, washed out by the rain, but I felt uneasy. I followed the trail that curved uphill behind the cabin, hoping to clear my head. It was quiet, too quiet. No birds, no wind. About a mile in, I found something I hadn't seen before. An old campfire, long dead, just ash and a circle of blackened stones. Around it were cigarette butts, an empty beer can, and a shredded tarp. Not recent, but not ancient either. The forest felt wrong. I turned back fast. I didn't like the thought of someone else camping nearby without me knowing. Back at the cabin, I decided I'd leave the next day. It wasn't fear exactly, it was pressure, like something waiting to break. That night, just before sunset, I spotted movement in the trees across the lake. It was brief, a figure maybe, or a shadow. I stared for a long time. Nothing moved again, but I didn't go outside. I ate cold food and kept my pistol beside me. I didn't sleep much. At some point in the early morning, I heard the crunch of footsteps outside. Slow, deliberate. They circled the cabin. I held my breath. I didn't move. The sound stopped near the back, by the shed. Then silence. I stayed like that for hours. When the sky began to lighten, I got up and opened the door slowly. The ground was damp with dew. I checked around the cabin. More boot prints. These were fresh. They led to the shed, then stopped. The door was open a few inches. I approached with my pistol raised. Inside, nothing. Just the tools and wood. That was enough. I packed my things as fast as I could. I started the truck and left the place behind, bouncing over rocks and roots. I didn't stop until I reached the main road. Once I had signal, I called my brother, told him I was coming home early. I didn't explain much. A few days later, I called the company that rented the cabin. I asked if anyone else was booked during my stay. They said no. I asked if it had been broken into recently. They said not that they knew of. I didn't push it further. I haven't been back. Sometimes I think maybe it was just my imagination, the forest playing tricks. But those prints were real. The footsteps were real. Someone was out there. Even now, when I think about it, I remember that feeling, not of being watched, but of being hunted. Not fast, not loud, just steady. Like something patient, waiting for me to let my guard down. I still camp sometimes, but not alone. Never again alone. It was mid-October when I decided to spend a week alone in a remote cabin deep in the forest of northern Maine. I had been burned out from work for months, mentally exhausted and physically drained. I needed the silence. I needed a place with no emails, no traffic, no buzzing phones, just trees, wind, and my thoughts. I found the place through a forum where people shared off-grid rentals. This one was a modest wooden cabin, old but well-maintained, surrounded by thick pine woods and far from the nearest paved road. There was no electricity, no running water, and no cell signal. Perfect. The owner left the key under a rusted horseshoe nailed to the doorframe. Inside, the cabin smelled of pine and old wood. The floor creaked, and the air was cool but dry. There was a wood stove in the corner, a cot with an old mattress, a table, a couple of wooden chairs, and some open shelves with dusty cookware and canned goods. I had brought my own supplies, though. Canned beans, rice, bottled water, a camp stove, and a good knife. I planned to read, write in my journal, maybe hike during the day, and sleep early at night. The first day passed peacefully. I chopped some firewood with the old axe left beside the shed and lit a fire inside. I ate a simple meal, read for a while, and turned in early. I remember lying in bed listening to the wind brushing against the trees outside and feeling, for the first time in months, a sense of real peace. The second day, I hiked a few miles into the forest. The trail wasn't marked, and I used red tape to mark my way back. It felt good to sweat and move through real silence. The forest was dense but beautiful. The colors of autumn were still holding on. Red and yellow leaves crunching under my boots. I didn't see another soul. That night, I felt even more relaxed, like I had made the right decision. On the third day, something felt off. I can't explain it, but I woke up around 5 a.m., before sunrise, with a strange pressure in my chest. Not pain, just pressure. Like a bad dream had followed me out of sleep. I got up and checked outside. The woods were still and dark. No movement. No sounds except the wind. I shook it off, made some coffee on the camp stove, and tried to read. But I kept feeling watched. Not in a paranoid way, just like something in the woods had shifted. Around noon, I went out again. I followed the same trail but took a different turn deeper into the trees. The forest floor was soft, covered in pine needles, and I didn't hear much except my own footsteps. About an hour in, I found something strange. A small pile of stones stacked neatly in a clearing. I stopped. There were 7 stones, arranged by size, biggest on the bottom, smallest on top. They were smooth and gray, and clearly not natural. Someone had built it. Maybe another hiker, I thought, but I hadn't seen any signs of other people. No wrappers, no footprints, no broken twigs. Nothing. I didn't touch the stones. I backed away slowly and turned around. On the way back, I kept checking over my shoulder, listening hard. I didn't hear anything unusual, but the silence now felt heavier. That night, I had trouble sleeping. The fire inside had gone out around midnight, and I didn't feel like getting up to relight it. I stayed under the heavy wool blanket and listened. The wind had picked up, but under it, I swore I heard faint crunching, like footsteps, far off, slow and uneven. I held my breath. The sound would come and go, and at times I thought maybe it was just my mind playing tricks. Maybe an animal. On the 4th day, I stayed close to the cabin. I didn't feel like walking into the woods again. I kept looking out the windows, checking the tree line. I still saw nothing. No one. But in the afternoon, I found something disturbing. Behind the cabin, about 30 feet into the woods, I noticed that some bark had been stripped off a tree. Clean cuts, vertical lines like someone had used a knife. At the base of the tree were more stones, smaller this time, arranged in a circle. I froze. I knew I hadn't put them there, and I hadn't seen them before. I was sure. My stomach twisted. Someone was out there. I walked back inside and locked the door, even though it was just a wooden latch. I kept the axe near me for the rest of the day. That night, I didn't sleep much. I heard the same crunching sounds again, closer this time. Then something tapped lightly against the cabin wall. Once, then again slower. I waited, heart pounding. I didn't look outside. On the 5th morning, I decided to leave. I had planned a full week, but I didn't care anymore. I packed up everything, made sure I left no trace, and started hiking back to where I had parked. It was a few miles down an old logging road that I had driven in on. But when I got to where my car should have been, it wasn't there. I stood still for a long time, staring at the empty space. My car was gone. There were no tire marks leading away. It hadn't been towed. No one even knew I was out there. I didn't hear any engines in the night. My mind raced. Had someone followed me? Had they waited for me to hike out and taken it? I felt sick. I checked the spot again, walked up and down the road, but there was nothing, just silence. My phone still had no signal, and I was miles from the nearest town. I considered going back to the cabin, but something in me refused. I walked further down the road, hoping to eventually find someone, anyone. After about an hour, I saw an old hunting stand off the road, rusty and broken. It was empty. Near it, I found a plastic wrapper and a boot print. Fresh. I bent down and studied it. It was a large print, maybe size 12, and deep enough to be recent. I stood up and looked around. I didn't hear anything. I walked for hours that day. No cars came, no people. I rationed my water and kept moving. Around sunset, I found an old ranger station, boarded up, no one inside. The place had clearly been abandoned for years. But around the back, I found a rusted CB radio antenna. Inside, under a pile of old gear, I found the radio itself. By some miracle, it still worked. I turned the knob, adjusted the frequencies, and tried calling for help. I kept calling for over an hour. Finally, a voice cracked through, faint but real. A trucker, I think. I gave him my rough coordinates and begged him to contact the local sheriff. He said he would. I spent the night in the old station with the axe by my side. I barely slept. The next morning, just after sunrise, I heard a vehicle. I ran out and waved down a sheriff's truck. The officer was wary at first, but after I explained, he took me in. We drove back to where my car had been. Still gone. He radioed for backup. They found my car a few days later, parked in a different spot miles away, undamaged, keys still inside. No fingerprints, no footprints, no evidence, nothing. I never got answers. No one found the person who had been in the woods. If it was a person, but it had to be. A person had to have moved the stones. Person had to have taken my car. Someone knew I was there. Someone watched me. I know it. I haven't gone back to the woods since. I won't. Whatever peace I was looking for in that cabin, I didn't find it. What I found instead was a reminder that the quietest places still hold the darkest corners. And sometimes the most dangerous thing out there isn't a ghost or a monster. It's just another person, watching, waiting, and you'll never know they're there until it's too late. I don't know what made me do it. Maybe I just wanted to feel something again. I had been stuck in the same dull loop every day, wake up, go to work, come back, eat something frozen, watch the same shows, sleep, then do it all again. I hadn't traveled in years. I hadn't even gone on a walk around my neighborhood in months. Life had become flat. One day, while scrolling through rental listings online, I came across a picture of a small wooden cabin. It was up in the north woods of Minnesota, near a place called Ely. The cabin was basic, just one bedroom, a tiny kitchen, a front porch, and a fireplace, but it was surrounded by thick forest. It stood completely alone, no neighbors in sight, and it sat right near a narrow lake. The ad said there was no cell signal, no Wi-Fi, no landline. That sounded perfect to me. I booked 4 nights. I didn't even tell anyone I was going. I just took a few days off work, packed some clothes, brought groceries and supplies, and drove up. Took me about 8 hours to get there. Most of the drive was highway, but the last hour was rough. Just a dirt road with deep grooves and loose rocks. By the time I finally pulled up to the clearing where the cabin stood, the sun was already getting low. The place looked exactly like the pictures. Gray-brown logs, a tin roof, and a wraparound porch with 1 wooden chair. The lake was still and black, with a thin line of trees mirrored on its surface. I could see fish breaking the water now and then. I turned off the car and stepped out. It was completely silent. No wind, no birds, no traffic. Just trees and water and the creaking of the cabin's wooden steps. Inside, the cabin was simple but clean. 1 room had a bed, a little dresser, and a bookshelf with a few old paperbacks. The kitchen had an electric stove, a small fridge, and a cast iron sink. There was a bathroom in the back with a compost toilet and a tiny shower that only ran cold water. There were no curtains on the windows, which made it feel even more exposed. But I liked it. I unpacked, made some pasta, and sat on the porch while I ate. By the time it got dark, I was exhausted from the drive. I locked the doors, brushed my teeth, and crawled into bed. I expected to lie awake a while, but I fell asleep fast. That first night, nothing happened. I slept hard, woke up around 6 a.m. with the sun shining through the windows. I made coffee, ate a protein bar, then sat on the porch again and watched the lake. I saw a deer drinking on the far side. There was no wind, no sound except my own breathing and the occasional creak of the porch wood as I shifted. Later that day, I decided to explore. I followed a narrow path through the woods that led around the lake. The trail was faint, barely more than some broken grass and flattened leaves, but I stayed on it. I didn't want to get lost. After maybe 40 minutes, I came across a collapsed wooden dock on the other side of the lake. The boards were rotting, but I could still see where it used to stretch out. There was a rusty chair half sunk in the water. That was the first time I felt something was off. It wasn't anything obvious, just a tension, like the woods had gotten heavier somehow. The trees felt like they were pressing in closer. I stood there a long time, looking at that broken dock, until I started to feel stupid and turned back. That night, I heard something outside. I had just gotten into bed when I heard slow, steady crunching sounds, like footsteps, but heavy and spaced apart. Then nothing, then more crunching, the sound of something big moving in the woods. I sat up in bed, listening. My heart was beating hard, but I told myself it was just a deer, or a moose maybe. That made sense. I didn't have a gun, but I had a big hunting knife in my bag. I took it out and kept it beside the bed. The next morning, I walked around the cabin to check. I didn't see anything at first, but then, near the back wall, I found a footprint in the dirt. A full boot print. Big, not mine. I checked it against my own just to be sure. It was longer, wider, and the tread was different. That made my stomach twist. Someone had been walking near my cabin in the middle of the night. I didn't want to overreact. I reminded myself that hunters use these woods. Maybe someone was passing through, but I couldn't shake the feeling that whoever it was had stopped to watch. I couldn't explain why I felt that, but I did. That day I didn't hike. I stayed close, sat on the porch with my knife, tried to read, but I couldn't concentrate. Every little sound made me snap my head up. I started to feel stupid. I told myself I was letting the silence get to me. I made a big dinner, canned chili and some instant rice, and tried to feel normal again. When it got dark, I locked everything up. I even pushed the dresser in front of the door. I know how that sounds. I know I was acting paranoid, but I didn't care. I just wanted to feel safe. Around midnight, I heard the crunching again. Closer this time. It circled the cabin. Slow, heavy steps. I didn't move. I just lay there, sweating, holding the knife. I didn't look out the window. I didn't want to know. I just waited. After maybe 10 minutes, it stopped. Silence again. I didn't sleep. In the morning, I walked the perimeter again. This time I saw more prints. Several. leading from the woods to the porch, then around the side, then disappearing into the trees. Some of them were half washed out, like someone had been there before and stepped in the same spot again. There were at least 2 different sets, maybe more. I went inside, locked the door, and stayed there. I thought about leaving, packing up and driving back home. But something in me didn't want to give up. I had 3 days left. I had come all this way. I thought maybe I'd stay inside until the last day and then leave early. That seemed like a plan. That evening, the wind picked up for the first time since I got there. It rattled the tin roof and made the trees sway. I sat by the window and watched the tree line. The woods felt like they were hiding something. I kept looking for movement between the trunks. Around 9 p.m., I saw it. A figure, just barely, deep in the trees, too far to see clearly. But it was there, still upright, human-shaped. Watching. I froze. I didn't blink. I just stared. After a few minutes, it stepped back and vanished into the trees. I turned off every light in the cabin and sat on the floor with my back to the wall, holding my knife. I didn't sleep that night either. At some point during the night, I heard the front steps creak. Just one creak, then nothing. When the sun came up, I packed everything in less than 5 minutes. I grabbed my bags, ran to the car, threw them in the back, and sped down that dirt road like my life depended on it. The tires skidded over rocks, and branches scraped the windows. I didn't care. I didn't stop driving until I hit the highway. When I got home, I took a long shower and slept for almost a whole day. I told myself I was done thinking about it, but I couldn't stop. I kept wondering what they wanted, why they were watching, why they didn't come in. Then, 2 days later, I got a text from an unknown number. No words, just a picture. It was my cabin, taken from the edge of the woods. The picture was taken at night, and the porch light was on. I hadn't left it on. That was the last message I ever got. I changed my number. I moved to a new apartment. I never went back to the woods, and I never will. It was early October when I decided to spend a week alone in a remote cabin deep in the Montana woods. I had rented the place online after looking for a quiet spot to unwind, away from the city noise, away from work pressure, and away from people. The listing showed an old wooden cabin with no nearby neighbors, surrounded by thick forest on all sides, and sitting near a narrow dirt road that twisted through the woods for miles. It looked perfect to me. I packed enough food for 7 days, filled my car with gear like a lantern, flashlight, batteries, 2 hunting knives, my .22 rifle, a pile of firewood, a camping stove just in case, and my hiking boots. I brought a notebook to write in, but I never used it once I got there. The drive took most of the day. It was dark by the time I turned off the highway and onto the dirt road that led to the cabin. My tires crunched over loose rocks and dirt, and the trees pressed in close to the road on both sides. I didn't pass a single car. I didn't see any lights, not even from distant houses. It was like entering a different world. When I reached the cabin, I parked and turned off the engine. Everything around me was silent, except for the sound of the wind moving through the trees. I got out of the car and shivered. The air was cold and sharp, smelling like pine and wet leaves. I used my flashlight to unlock the front door. The cabin was small, just one main room with a wood-burning stove in one corner, a small kitchen area, a table with 2 chairs, and a bed with a thin mattress. The bathroom was in the back, and there was no shower, only a toilet and a sink. The water came from a tank that had to be filled manually, which I already expected. There was no electricity besides a single solar-powered light in the ceiling that didn't do much. I lit a few candles I had brought and unpacked my things. The first night, I stayed up a while reading and listening to the wind. I slept deeply. I didn't feel scared. I liked the quiet. The next few days, I spent hiking through the woods, chopping some wood for the stove, and sitting on the porch watching the trees. I saw deer and squirrels. Once I heard a howl far off at night that made my skin prickle, but I told myself it was a coyote. Maybe a wolf, though those were rare. By the 4th day, I felt different. I had stopped seeing animals, not even birds. I hadn't heard a single chirp in hours. That struck me as strange. Even deep in the woods, there was usually sound. Birds, insects, squirrels, something. The forest felt too quiet. I thought maybe it was just in my head. I kept busy. I cleaned the cabin a little, boiled water to wash up, and read an old field guide I found in one of the drawers. But I kept looking out the window, staring into the woods. Couldn't say why. I didn't see anything. Still, something felt off. That night, I didn't sleep well. I kept waking up to sounds. Not loud, just small noises. Crunching leaves, sticks snapping. Sometimes it sounded like footsteps, but I told myself it was probably animals, or just the wind. In the morning, I went outside and walked around the cabin. I saw faint prints in the dirt by the trees. Not clear enough to tell if they were animal or human. They were too big for a rabbit, too small for a bear. I bent down and looked closer. Some of the prints looked like boots. They weren't mine. My boots had a different tread pattern. I felt a knot grow in my stomach. I tried to stay calm. Maybe a hiker came through the area. Maybe someone else had a cabin nearby, even if I hadn't seen it. Still, I double-checked that the doors and windows were locked. I brought my rifle inside just to be safe. That night, the sounds were louder. Something moved around outside the cabin. It circled. I could hear leaves rustling, twigs snapping. Once, I heard a thump near the back wall. I turned off the lamp and sat still on the bed, holding the rifle across my lap, heart pounding. Whatever it was, it didn't try to break in. Eventually, the sounds faded. I stayed awake until sunrise. The next morning, I stepped outside and looked around again. This time, I saw clearer boot prints. Definitely human. They led from the tree line to the back wall of the cabin, then around to the front door and back into the woods. I followed them a few yards before they disappeared into the underbrush. I stood there for a long time. There was no one around. I didn't see or hear anything moving. Still, I felt watched. The hair on my arms stood up. I went back inside and locked the door. I started thinking about leaving early, but I told myself I was being paranoid. I still had food and supplies. I still had my rifle. It was probably just someone passing through. Maybe a hunter. Maybe a forest worker. I kept repeating those thoughts all day. That night, I didn't sleep. I kept the rifle close. Around 2 or 3 in the morning, I heard a loud bang on the back wall, then a dragging sound. My stomach turned. I froze. I didn't move. I didn't breathe. The dragging stopped. Then silence. I stayed like that until sunrise. In the morning, I walked to the back of the cabin. There were deep scratches on the wood. Not animal claws. These looked like they were made by metal. A knife maybe. A long blade. Someone had dragged something sharp across the wall. That was it for me. I packed up my stuff, loaded my car, and planned to drive out. When I tried to start the car, the engine clicked but didn't turn over. I tried again. Same thing. Battery was fine. Gas was full. But it wouldn't start. I popped the hood. The spark plug wires were gone. Not chewed. Cut. Clean. Someone had done it on purpose. I felt cold all over. I looked around, slowly turning full circle. The woods were still, empty, quiet, but I knew someone was out there. I ran back inside and locked the door. I tried using my phone, but I had no signal. I hadn't had service since I got there. There was no landline, no radio. I was stuck. I spent the rest of the day checking windows, listening for sounds, jumping at every crack or creak. That night, I blocked the door with furniture and sat with the rifle in my lap. I didn't sleep. At some point past midnight, I heard movement again. This time, it came from the roof. Slow footsteps. I held my breath. I heard a creak, then another. Then something dropped onto the porch. I heard the wood groan. Then I heard footsteps moving away. I didn't go outside until the sun was fully up. When I opened the door, I found something on the porch. It was a dead squirrel cut open neatly. Its insides were removed. Its eyes were missing. It had been placed in the center of the porch like an offering or a warning. I threw up over the side of the steps. I knew I had to get out. I packed a small backpack with food, water, the rifle, and a flashlight. I left everything else behind. I figured I could follow the dirt road back to the highway. It would take hours, maybe all day, but I had to try. Before I left, I took a piece of paper and wrote where I was going and why. I left it on the table inside the cabin in case someone found it later. I locked the door and started walking. The woods were silent as I moved. Every time the wind shifted, I thought I heard footsteps behind me. Every time a branch snapped, I spun around. I never saw anyone. Still, I knew I was being followed. I kept moving. I didn't stop to rest. Around noon, I saw something hanging from a tree near the road. I walked closer and saw it was a boot. A single muddy boot, hanging by its laces. It wasn't mine. I kept going. Then I saw more signs. A torn jacket on a branch. A crushed water bottle. A hat with blood on the rim. All of them were old, faded, weathered. They didn't look like they'd been left recently. I didn't know if they were warnings or trophies. I started running. At some point in the afternoon, I saw a clearing up ahead. A car passed by on a road in the distance. I stumbled toward it, waving my arms. The driver stopped. I didn't know the man. I couldn't even speak. He looked alarmed and let me into the truck. I tried to explain. I told him about the cabin, the noises, the dead animal, the footsteps. He listened quietly. When I finished, he nodded slowly and told me something that still makes my blood go cold. He said I wasn't the first. Over the years, hikers had gone missing in that part of the woods. A few cabins had been broken into. Some were found empty. Others were found with strange marks on the walls, like mine. But no one had ever been caught, and some bodies were never found at all. I reported everything to the sheriff. He said they would investigate. They never found anything. They went to the cabin. My car was still there, but the wires were back in place. No scratches on the wall, no dead squirrel. It was like someone had cleaned up. I never went back. I never went into the woods again. Even now, years later, I still check my locks 3 times before bed. I still wake up at night thinking I hear footsteps outside. I keep a loaded rifle by my bed because I know someone was out there, and I don't think they were done. I rented the cabin because I needed to get away. I'd been working 6 days a week, barely sleeping, barely eating right, and my head felt like it was going to crack open from the constant stress. I wasn't thinking about anything paranormal or dangerous. I just wanted quiet. I wanted to sleep without hearing car horns or neighbors shouting through the walls. I didn't want to open my phone every 2 minutes. I didn't want anyone to know where I was, just for a while. I booked the place through a small website, not a major one. It was cheaper and more remote. The cabin was in the hills somewhere outside of Asheville, North Carolina. The ad said there was no Wi-Fi, barely any cell signal, and you had to bring your own food and water. I didn't care. That sounded perfect. I just wanted isolation. The guy who owned it sent me the code for the lockbox and told me to let myself in and leave the key when I was done. No one else would be there. I drove up on a Thursday morning early in the fall. The trees were just starting to turn orange and red. It took me almost 4 hours to get there, winding through back roads and dirt trails. My SUV's GPS lost signal about 20 minutes before I arrived, and I had to rely on memory from the directions I printed out. That didn't bother me. In fact, it made me feel like I was really leaving everything behind. The cabin was small, just 1 floor, made of old wood with a green roof and a front porch with a rusty chair. There was no one else around. No neighbors, no power lines, no cars. Just trees. The forest was thick, and the hills blocked most of the sky. I only saw a little patch of blue above the clearing. The quiet was almost uncomfortable at first. No sirens, no traffic, not even the distant hum of airplanes. Just wind, birds, and the occasional cracking branch. I got out, stretched my legs, and unloaded my stuff. I had packed enough food and bottled water for a few days, a flashlight, a knife, extra batteries, a thick sleeping bag, and some books. There was no TV, obviously, and the radio in my truck barely worked this far out. I left the key in the lockbox and stepped inside. The place was cleaner than I expected. 1 room with a twin bed, a small table, a few chairs, and a kitchenette with a sink that drained into a bucket. No running water. There was a little wood stove in the corner and a stack of chopped wood beside it. The bathroom was an outhouse about 20 feet behind the cabin. I spent the first day settling in. I unpacked, made a sandwich, and walked around the property. The air smelled like leaves and dirt. I kept hearing things. Squirrels, maybe deer, birds hopping between branches, but never saw anything up close. I went to bed early that night. No screens, no distractions. Just the sound of wind pushing through the trees. The first night was uneventful. I woke up once or twice because of how quiet it was, which sounds strange, but total silence is its own kind of loud when you're used to city noise. I slept okay though. It was the second night when things started to feel strange. I spent most of the day reading and hiking. I didn't go far, just a loop around the cabin, maybe a mile or two. I had a small compass and marked trees with a pocket knife as I went, just to be sure I could find my way back. Around noon, I thought I saw something move in the trees. A flash of red between the trunks. Maybe a jacket. I froze and stared for a long time, but it didn't move again. I figured it was probably some hunter or another hiker. I didn't think much of it. That night, I lit a candle and read until my eyes hurt. Then I got in my sleeping bag and tried to fall asleep. It must have been around 2 a.m. when I woke up. I didn't know why at first. No sound, no dreams I remembered. I just opened my eyes and felt off. You know that feeling when someone's standing too close behind you, even if you can't see them? That's what it felt like. I was lying still in the dark, only faint moonlight coming through the window, and I had that cold, heavy feeling in my gut like I wasn't alone. I sat up slowly and listened. There was nothing at first, just silence. I thought maybe a raccoon or something had brushed against the outside wall. Maybe the wind knocked something over. Then I heard a footstep. It was clear. Dry leaves. Crunch. Just one. I froze. I didn't even breathe. I waited for another. About 10 seconds later, another one. Closer. Crunch. I slipped my hand into my bag and pulled out the small flashlight. I flicked it on and pointed it at the window. Nothing. The glass had some dust on it, and the light barely reached the trees outside. I thought about getting up and checking the porch, but I couldn't move. I kept telling myself it was probably a deer, maybe a big one, or a bear, but something about the rhythm of the steps felt off. They were too slow, one every 10 or 15 seconds, then nothing for a full minute. I stayed up for another hour, listening, but heard nothing else. I finally laid back down, but I kept the flashlight in my hand. The next morning, I walked around the cabin. I didn't see anything strange until I checked the side wall. About 6 feet up, there were marks. 3 of them straight lines scratched into the wood. Not deep, but fresh. The wood had peeled back like someone ran something sharp against it. They were spaced too far apart to be animal claws. I stared at them for a long time. I decided to keep my knife on me the rest of the time. That day, I didn't go far. I stayed close to the cabin. Every time the wind moved the branches, I looked up. I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. I barely ate. I didn't want to leave early though. I didn't want to tell myself I'd been scared off by a few noises and marks. That night, the footsteps came back. This time I didn't wait. I jumped up and pulled on my boots. I grabbed my flashlight and slowly opened the front door. The air was cold. I stepped out onto the porch. Nothing. The forest was dead silent. The moon was bright enough that I didn't need the flashlight at first. I walked around the cabin, checking the windows and the trees. And then I saw it. A figure, standing still, about 30 feet away between 2 trees. Not moving. It wasn't an animal. It was a person. I could see the shape. Arms, legs, head. No light, no face, just a silhouette. I froze. It didn't move. Neither did I. I stood there for maybe 10 seconds, then slowly raised the flashlight and clicked it on. It was gone. I swear I saw it. I didn't imagine it. But the beam of the flashlight only showed empty trees. I walked over to where it had stood. There were leaves, but no footprints. Nothing disturbed. I backed up and went inside. I locked the door, slid the small table in front of it, and stayed up the rest of the night with the flashlight in my lap. In the morning, I walked out to the spot again. Still nothing. I should have left right then, but I didn't. I kept telling myself I was just tired. that I was on edge from the silence, the isolation. I told myself the cabin was safe, that the owner would have said something if there were bears or hunters nearby, that maybe the marks on the wall were from some old tool. But I knew I was lying to myself. The next night was the worst. I didn't sleep. I kept all the lights on, flashlights, candles, even a lantern I had packed. I sat in the corner of the room with my back against the wall, my knife in one hand and the flashlight in the other. Around midnight, I started hearing it again. Footsteps, slow, crunch, crunch, then silence, then a tap. One tap on the glass of the front window. I pointed the flashlight. Nothing. Then another tap. On the side window. Then something scraped against the wood. Long, slow, like nails or a blade dragging across it. I stood up and yelled, but of course there was no answer. I ran to the window, shining the light in every direction. I saw nothing. Then I heard the porch creak. I turned, heart pounding, and stared at the front door. Something was standing on the porch. I could hear it, breathing, heavy, just outside the door. Then a knock. 3 slow knocks. I didn't move. Another knock. I turned off the lights. All of them. I crouched by the bed and waited. I held my breath for so long I almost passed out. I didn't hear it leave, but by morning it was gone. I packed everything in 15 minutes. I didn't eat, didn't use the bathroom. I threw it all in the back of the SUV, locked the cabin, and drove. I didn't care about the roads or the trees or the directions. I just drove downhill until I had a signal. I stopped at a gas station and called the cabin owner. I told him someone had been messing around out there. He told me that wasn't possible. No one lived out there. No one had access to the land. He sounded annoyed, like I was bothering him. I didn't argue. I didn't want an explanation anymore. I just wanted to go home. I never found out who it was, or what they wanted. I checked the news, but nothing ever came up. No missing hikers, no sightings, no arrests. I still don't know if it was one person or more. I don't know how they knew I was alone. But I know what I heard. I know what I saw. I still think about it sometimes, how it waited until I was asleep. I needed a break. Work had been nonstop for months, and I was starting to feel like a shell of myself. So, I booked a remote cabin in the Oregon mountains for a week in early November. I wanted silence, trees, and no one around for miles. The cabin I chose was isolated, a 2-hour drive from the nearest town, and only reachable by a long, winding dirt road that crawled through thick forest. It sounded perfect. The day I arrived, the sky was gray and heavy. It had been raining on and off during the drive, and by the time I pulled up to the cabin, the ground was soft with mud. The place looked even more remote than it had in the photos. It sat in a small clearing, surrounded on all sides by towering pine trees. The wooden structure was old but solid. There was a small porch, a single front door, and a narrow chimney sticking out the roof. No other cabins nearby, no cell service, no neighbors, just me, the forest, and the wind. Inside, the cabin was simple. One main room with a wood stove, a small kitchen off to the left, a bathroom in the back, and a steep staircase leading to a loft with a bed. The electricity ran on a small generator out back, and there was no Wi-Fi. I didn't mind. That was the whole point. I brought books, a journal, some food supplies, and a few tools just in case. The first day passed quietly. I spent the afternoon unloading my things, setting up the place, and taking a short walk through the woods behind the cabin. The air was cool and crisp, and everything smelled like damp earth and pine needles. That night, I lit a fire in the wood stove and fell asleep to the sound of rain on the roof. The second day, I explored further. I followed a narrow trail I'd found near the back of the property. It wound deeper into the woods, leading me past moss-covered logs and fallen branches. After about an hour of walking, I found a small stream and stopped to rest. I sat there for a while, just listening to the water and birds. No cars, no people, nothing man-made. On the way back, I noticed something strange. The trail was harder to follow. It seemed different, like the path had changed behind me. I brushed it off, thinking maybe I was tired or just hadn't been paying close enough attention. I managed to find my way back to the cabin just as the sun was starting to set. That night, something woke me up. I didn't know what time it was, but it was still dark. The generator had shut off like it always did at midnight, so the only light came from the moon. I lay there in the loft listening. It was dead silent. Then I heard it, a faint creaking sound, like floorboards being stepped on. At first I thought maybe it was the wood settling. Old cabins do that. But then I heard it again, closer. I got up slowly and looked over the edge of the loft. I couldn't see anything in the dark, but I felt uneasy. I waited for a while, standing completely still, holding my breath. After a few minutes, the sound stopped. I eventually crawled back into bed and tried to sleep, but I didn't feel relaxed. I felt watched. In the morning, everything looked normal. I checked the front door, which I'd locked the night before. Still locked. No signs of anything strange. I told myself I'd imagine the sound, maybe mixed it up with a dream, but I couldn't shake the feeling. That afternoon, I walked the trail again, this time carrying a hatchet just in case. I don't usually get paranoid, but I didn't like how I'd felt the night before. I didn't go as far this time, just enough to stretch my legs. When I returned to the cabin, I found something that made my stomach drop. On the porch, lying right in front of the door, was a small pile of rocks stacked carefully on top of each other. For stones, each a little smaller than the one beneath it. I hadn't put them there. I looked around the woods, but there was no one in sight. No footprints in the mud. Nothing. I felt a chill run through me. I kicked the rocks over and went inside, locking the door behind me. I kept the hatchet close that night. Again, I woke in the middle of the night. This time, I heard something scraping against the side of the cabin. Not the roof, the side right near the window. A slow, dragging sound, like metal against wood. I didn't move. I just lay there listening. Then it stopped. I waited for a long time, staring at the ceiling. Eventually, I drifted off again. In the morning, I checked outside. There were scratch marks on the wood paneling beneath the window. Long, thin lines. I didn't know what made them. I looked around again, but still saw no sign of anyone. The woods felt different now. Not peaceful, not quiet, just tense, like they were holding their breath. I considered leaving early, but I told myself I was overreacting. Maybe animals had left the marks. Maybe the rocks had fallen like that by chance. Maybe I was just letting the isolation mess with my head. That evening, I skipped the walk. I stayed indoors, reading and drinking tea. I didn't want to be outside anymore. The wind picked up as night fell, and the trees outside swayed hard. The cabin creaked more than usual. I kept the fire going and made sure all the doors and windows were locked. At around 2 in the morning, I woke up to a loud bang. Came from outside. I jumped out of bed, heart racing, and ran to the loft window. I couldn't see much in the dark, but I thought I saw something move at the edge of the tree line. I grabbed my flashlight and the hatchet, then went downstairs. I opened the door just a crack and shined the light outside. There, hanging from the porch railing, was a small animal trap. The metal jaws were open, and a piece of cloth was caught inside. A piece of my shirt, the one I'd used to dry dishes the day before. I had left it hanging by the wood stove. It was gone now. I slammed the door shut and locked it. I didn't sleep that night. I sat by the fire, hatchet in hand, waiting for the sun to come up. When it did, I packed everything and got ready to leave. I didn't care if I'd paid for the full week. I just wanted out. But when I tried to start the car, it didn't turn over. I checked the engine, the battery, everything looked fine, but it just wouldn't start. I tried over and over until the battery drained. I sat behind the wheel, sweating even though it was cold, and staring at the road. I didn't know what else to do. I had no phone service, no way to call for help, and the nearest town was too far to walk to before dark. So I stayed another night. I moved the couch in front of the door and blocked the windows with furniture. I kept the fire going all night and didn't let myself sleep. Around midnight, I heard footsteps again. This time they were right outside the wall behind me. Slow, steady steps circling the cabin. Then they stopped. Everything went silent. I held my breath. A few minutes later, I heard the sound of someone trying the front door handle. Slow, deliberate clicks. I waited. Nothing happened. The footsteps moved again, back around the cabin, then stopped beneath the loft window. I heard a thud, like someone jumping down from it, then silence. The next morning, I walked outside with the hatchet raised. The animal trap was gone. The scratch marks were deeper, and in the mud behind the cabin, I saw a single footprint. A boot print, much larger than mine. I knew I wasn't alone out there. Someone was watching me, moving around at night, waiting. I didn't waste any more time. I packed what I could carry and started walking. I didn't stop to rest. I followed the dirt road back toward the highway. After several hours of walking, I finally got a weak signal on my phone and called for help. A ranger picked me up 2 hours later. He asked why I was out there on foot. I just told him the car broke down. I didn't say anything else. I didn't want to talk about it. When I got home, I had the car towed and inspected. The mechanic said the wires to the ignition had been cut clean, like with a knife. No animal did that. Someone had wanted me stuck out there. I never found out who. The police went to check the cabin, but they didn't find anyone. No footprints, no traps, nothing. They said I was probably just spooked. But I know what I heard. I know what I saw. I haven't gone camping since. I don't plan to again. That cabin was supposed to be an escape, a break. Instead, it turned into the worst week of my life. And whoever was out there, they're still out there in those woods waiting for the next person to come alone. I was tired of the city. The honking, the constant rush, the concrete closing in around me. I needed a break from everything. From people, from my phone, from the noise. I wanted to be somewhere quiet, somewhere still. I started looking into cabins online. Not the fancy kind with hot tubs and Wi-Fi, but something remote and simple. Eventually, I found one in the mountains of Montana. It was owned by an old man who barely used it anymore. No electricity, no running water, just a wood stove and a hand pump outside for water. He said it was 5 miles off a dirt road and another mile through the trees on foot. That was perfect for me. I took some time off work, packed up my truck with everything I thought I'd need. Food, water containers, a propane lantern, books, a knife, a hatchet, sleeping bag, warm clothes, extra socks, and a small solar charger for emergencies. I left early in the morning and drove straight through. The last bit of road was rough. My truck bounced over rocks and dipped into potholes. The forest around me grew thicker the deeper I drove. I finally parked on a patch of flattened dirt and slung my backpack over my shoulder. Walking the last mile with nothing but trees around me felt peaceful. The air was cold and fresh. The cabin wasn't big, just a single room made of old logs with a tin roof. The windows were dusty and the wooden door creaked loud when I opened it. Inside was simple. A cot, a small table, a chair, the wood stove, and some old shelves with canned food and matches. I swept out the dust, lit a small fire in the stove, and set up my stuff. I felt good, felt real. The quiet was something I hadn't had in years. That first night, I slept well. I woke up once to the sound of wind, but I drifted off again quickly. The next day, I chopped firewood and explored the area. There was a creek not far from the cabin, and animal tracks in the soft earth. I saw deer, maybe elk, and some smaller prints that I didn't recognize, probably raccoons or foxes. I filled my water containers, cooked on a small gas burner, and spent the evening reading by the light of the propane lantern. On the third day, I hiked farther out, maybe 3 miles east of the cabin. I wanted to see more of the woods. I found a rock outcropping that gave me a wide view of the forest. Trees as far as I could see, some snow still clinging to the northern slopes. As I headed back, I noticed something strange. The woods were too quiet. I stopped and listened. No birds, no wind, just silence. It wasn't like earlier when the quiet felt peaceful. This was different, heavy. I shook it off and kept walking. Back at the cabin, I made a small dinner. The wind had picked up and was whistling through the trees. I set extra logs by the stove and kept the fire going strong. When I went out to use the bathroom, which was just a hole in the ground behind some bushes, I felt watched. I turned around quickly, shining my flashlight into the trees. Nothing, just branches moving with the wind. I went back inside and bolted the door. That night, I had trouble sleeping. I kept hearing things, small noises, like something brushing against the side of the cabin. Once, I heard what sounded like crunching leaves near the window. I got up and looked outside. My breath fogged the glass. It was too dark to see anything. I went back to bed and pulled my sleeping bag tighter. In the morning, I walked around the cabin. I found prints in the dirt. Not boot prints, not animal prints. They looked like bare feet, human but smaller than mine. They circled the cabin. Some led off into the woods. I stared at them for a long time. I kept telling myself it was probably just an old hunter or hiker, maybe someone camping nearby who wandered past. But who walks barefoot in the woods in cold weather? I tried to shake it off, but my stomach felt tight. The next night was worse. I heard tapping on the windows. I tried to ignore it, thinking it was branches, but then I realized there were no trees that close to the cabin. The tapping moved from one window to another. I didn't move. I just lay there in the dark, barely breathing. I kept my hand on the knife next to my sleeping bag. It went on for hours, then silence. When daylight finally came, I went outside. More prints, this time closer to the door. A few right below the windows. I was done pretending it was nothing. I packed up most of my gear and hiked back to my truck to check if it was still okay. It was. I almost left then and there, but I told myself I was overreacting. I drove back to the dirt patch and hiked back in, but my heart wasn't in it anymore. That night, I didn't sleep at all. I sat in the chair, holding the knife, the lantern turned low. Around 2 a.m., I heard footsteps. Slow, deliberate steps circling the cabin. Then tapping again. The doorknob rattled. I held my breath. It stopped. Then I heard something scrape against the wall. Long, dragging sounds. I stayed like that until the sky started to turn gray. In the morning, I opened the door and saw marks on the wood. Scratches. Deep ones. As if someone had dragged something sharp along the wall. I found a dead rabbit near the steps. Its head was missing. I didn't think. I grabbed the rest of my gear and left. I didn't look back. I walked fast, then ran. When I got back to the truck, I drove without stopping. I didn't sleep until I was home. I told a few people about it, but they just said it was probably a wild animal or some crazy local messing with me. But I know what I saw. I know what I heard. I haven't gone back to the woods since then. I still think about it sometimes late at night. The silence, the prints, the scratching. I don't know who or what was out there, but it wasn't just the woods, and it wasn't just in my head. I went there to be alone, but something else was already there, watching. I didn't go back to work right away. I stayed home, locking the doors even during the day. I kept thinking maybe whoever was out there had followed me. I kept checking the backyard, the windows, even though I was miles away from that place. A week later, I finally called the old man who owned the cabin. I asked him if anyone had ever reported anything strange up there. He paused for a long time. Then he said, "No, nothing strange. Just that he stopped going up there years ago because he never felt alone, even when he was." I hung up the phone. I didn't say anything else. There was nothing left to say. It's been months now. I still don't sleep that well. Sometimes I wake up and think I hear tapping or footsteps, but when I look, there's nothing. I still try to tell myself it was nothing, but something in me knows better. Something in me knows I wasn't supposed to be there, that I saw something I wasn't supposed to see. I went looking for quiet. I found something else. It started with a simple idea. I needed a break from everything. Work had been piling up. My phone never stopped buzzing, and I felt like I was slowly being drained. I was tired of the screens, the traffic, the people. I needed to get away, just for a little while, and be somewhere quiet, somewhere where no one would bother me. So I rented a cabin up north in the mountains. It wasn't anything fancy, just an old wooden cabin sitting near a lake, with nothing around it for miles. The listing promised no Wi-Fi, no neighbors, and complete silence. That was exactly what I needed. I packed up my truck with food, bottled water, a first aid kit, a flashlight, and some firewood. I brought a few books too, but mostly I just wanted to sleep and walk and not think. The drive took about 8 hours. The road got more narrow and rough the further I drove. Trees closed in around me. The air felt cleaner. When I finally arrived, it was early evening. The sun was low, casting long shadows across the dirt road and the edge of the lake. The cabin looked old but solid. It had a small porch, 2 windows in the front, and a heavy wooden door. There was a woodpile stacked neatly against the side and a metal chimney poking out of the roof. Inside, it smelled like dust and dry wood. There was one room with a bed, a table, a small kitchen area, and an old fireplace. A door in the back led to a tiny bathroom. Everything was basic, but that was fine. I unpacked, made a quick meal, and sat on the porch until it got dark. The stars came out, brighter than I remembered them ever being. The first night was peaceful. I slept deeper than I had in months. No sounds of cars or phones, just wind moving through trees and the faint rustle of leaves. I woke up early and made coffee on the propane stove. Then I went for a walk around the lake. There wasn't a path, so I just followed the edge of the water, stepping over rocks and fallen branches. I saw deer tracks in the mud and a few birds flitting through the trees. I didn't see a single person. That was the whole point. I spent the next few days doing the same thing.
Walk, ut, nop, read.
I chopped some wood for the fireplace. I made simple meals. I wrote a little in a notebook I brought. Time passed slowly, but that felt good. I was starting to feel like myself again. But on the 4th night, something changed. It was almost midnight. I was in bed, half asleep, when I heard something outside. It was a soft sound, like a footstep on leaves. Then another. I held my breath and listened. For a few seconds, everything was quiet. Then I heard it again, a little closer this time. I told myself it was probably an animal. Maybe a deer, maybe a raccoon. I tried to ignore it, but the sound didn't go away. It moved around the side of the cabin, slow and steady. I got out of bed and stood still, listening. The steps stopped near the front porch. I waited, heart pounding. I didn't have a gun, just a hatchet I used for splitting wood. I didn't turn on any lights. I didn't want whoever or whatever was out there to know I was awake. I walked slowly to the front window and peeked out. I couldn't see anything at first. Then, after a few seconds, I saw a shape. Just a shadow, standing near the edge of the trees. It didn't move. I stared at it, trying to make out what it was. It looked like a person. Tall, still, couldn't see a face. I backed away from the window, careful not to make a sound. I sat on the edge of the bed and waited. I don't know how long I sat there. Maybe an hour, maybe 2. Eventually, I fell asleep with the hatchet beside me. The next morning, I went outside and looked around. There were footprints in the dirt. Human footprints. They came from the woods, circled the cabin, and went back the way they came. They were big, bigger than mine. I tried to laugh it off. Maybe some hunter got lost. Maybe someone was hiking and came too close. I tried to forget it, but that night the footsteps came back. This time they were louder, slower, like whoever it was wanted me to hear them. I didn't sleep. I sat in the corner with the hatchet, watching the door. I kept thinking about how far I was from anyone else. No cell signal, no roads nearby. If something happened, no one would know. In the morning, I checked again. More footprints, same pattern, in and out of the woods. I found a spot near the edge of the trees where the grass was pressed down, like someone had been sitting there for a long time, watching. That whole day, I felt like I was being watched. I kept looking over my shoulder. Every sound in the woods made me jump. I almost left that day. I almost packed up and drove out. But I told myself maybe it was all in my head. Maybe I was just on edge. The 6th night was worse. The footsteps came earlier. They circled the cabin, then stopped right outside the front door. I didn't move. I could hear breathing. Slow, deep breaths, just on the other side of the wall. Then I heard the door handle move. Just a slight rattle, like someone was testing it. I had locked it, but it wasn't a strong lock. I held the hatchet tight and didn't make a sound. After what felt like forever, the sound stopped. I waited another hour before I moved. I didn't sleep that night either. The next day, I made a decision. I was going to leave the next morning. I didn't want to drive in the dark, so I packed up most of my things during the day. I kept the hatchet with me and didn't go far from the cabin. I didn't want to be caught off guard. That night, I didn't sleep. I sat by the door waiting. Around midnight, the footsteps came again. But this time, there were two sets. One moved to the front door. The other went around to the back. I could hear them both. I knew what was going to happen. They were testing the doors, the windows. I moved quietly to the back door and wedged a chair under the handle. Then I went to the front and did the same. I turned off all the lights and waited. For hours, they circled the cabin. I could hear them whispering, though I couldn't make out the words. I didn't move. I didn't make a sound. Eventually, just before dawn, the sound stopped. I waited until it was fully light before I went outside. The footprints were everywhere. They had walked around the cabin again and again, just outside the walls. I didn't waste any more time. I grabbed my bag, got in the truck, and left. The drive back was long. I kept looking in the mirror, expecting to see someone following me. I didn't stop until I was back in my city. When I got home, I locked every door and every window. I didn't sleep for days. I never found out who they were. I told the local sheriff in the town near the cabin. He took a report but said they couldn't do much without a name or a face. He said it might have been squatters or drifters, maybe hunters messing around. But his voice didn't sound convinced. I haven't gone back since. I still think about it, though. Sometimes I wonder what would have happened if I hadn't left. If I had stayed just one more night. That trip was supposed to help me get away from stress, but it left me with something worse. Now, even in my apartment, I wake up at night and listen for footsteps. I keep a hatchet next to my bed, just in case. That was the only reason I went. I was tired of the constant noise in the city, my phone ringing every hour, the construction outside my apartment, the late-night drunks screaming under my window. I just wanted a break. A few days alone with no internet, no one calling me, and nothing to bother me. I didn't need luxury or anything fancy. I just wanted space, silence, and time. I found the cabin listed on a site that specialized in off-grid stays. It was buried in the mountains, about 45 minutes from the nearest town and another 25 minutes of dirt road climbing uphill. The photos showed a small, boxy wooden cabin surrounded by thick pine trees, with a metal roof and a narrow front porch. The kind of place where no one could bother you because they couldn't even find you. It was October, midweek, and the rates were dirt cheap. The site warned that there was no running water, limited power from solar panels, and spotty cell reception. Perfect. I packed clothes, some canned food, a water jug, a flashlight, a knife, my old radio, and a couple of paperbacks. I planned to sleep, read, and maybe hike if the weather held up. I left early Wednesday morning. Took me most of the day to get there, longer than I expected. The last part of the drive was rough, winding through narrow mountain roads full of potholes, with trees crowding the edges. I saw only 2 other cars the whole time, and both were parked outside small, isolated houses that looked more like shacks. By the time I arrived, the sky was already turning orange. The cabin looked just like the pictures, maybe smaller in person, but it was neat and solid. It sat on a sloped clearing with trees surrounding it on 3 sides. Behind it was a deep drop, a ravine steep and tangled with brush and pine. There was a single dirt path leading from the front porch out to a wider trail. I parked beside the cabin, turned off the engine, and listened. Nothing. Not a bird. Not the wind. Just stillness. The silence felt like medicine. Inside, the cabin was basic. A wood stove in the corner, a single bed with a thin mattress, a small table and chair, a shelf with some firewood, and a solar-powered light that flickered when I turned it on. There was a composting toilet in a separate shed a few yards away, and a small storage box with extra blankets, candles, and a first aid kit. I unpacked, set up my sleeping bag on the bed, and opened a can of soup. I didn't feel scared, just alone, and that was exactly what I wanted. That first night, I slept hard. The next morning, I woke up to cold air and soft light. The solar light had gone out during the night. I stepped outside and looked down into the ravine behind the cabin. It was steep, about 30 feet down, with thick trees and dense brush. I could see a dried-out stream at the bottom, filled with old branches and rocks. I wondered if animals came through there at night. I spent the day hiking around. I followed the trail past the cabin for a couple miles. It was overgrown in places and didn't seem to be used much. At one point, I found an old hunting blind in a tree. This ladder was rotting and the platform above was sagging, half collapsed. I didn't see any deer, just squirrels and birds. When I got back, I made a fire in the stove and heated up another can of food. As the sun dipped behind the ridge, I sat on the porch and watched the sky turn pink and purple. Again, no sound. No cars, no voices, no planes. Just cold air and tall trees. I stayed there until it got dark. That night, I woke up once. It was sometime after midnight. I didn't know what woke me at first, but then I thought I heard something outside. A quick crunch like a footstep on dry leaves. Then another. I sat up in bed and held my breath. Silence. I waited. Nothing else came. Maybe it was a deer or a raccoon. I lay back down, but I didn't fall asleep right away. I kept listening, watching the black outline of the window, waiting to hear the sound again. I never did. The next day was colder. A thin layer of frost clung to the grass. I boiled water for tea and ate a protein bar. I didn't hike that day. Instead, I walked the edges of the clearing around the cabin, looking for tracks or signs of animals. I saw some prints near the back of the cabin, leading toward the ravine. Not shoe prints, more like hooves, maybe a deer. I followed them to the edge, but they disappeared into the brush. That evening, I sat on the porch again, wrapped in a blanket. I stared at the trees. I didn't know why, but I started feeling uneasy. It wasn't anything I could explain, just a sense that something wasn't right. The woods felt different, heavier, like they were watching. I went inside early, locked the door, and moved the chair under the knob. I knew it wouldn't stop someone if they really wanted to get in, but it made me feel better. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling in the dark. That night, I woke up again. Same thing, dead quiet, then a noise outside, a single crunch. Not an animal. It sounded too deliberate, too slow. I sat up and grabbed the flashlight from the crate beside the bed. I didn't turn it on right away. I just sat there, breathing as quietly as I could, listening. Another crunch. Closer. I stood up, walked silently to the window, and peered out. The flashlight was still in my hand, but I didn't use it. I didn't see anything at first, just trees and darkness. Then I saw movement, down near the edge of the ravine. A figure. It was far away, almost hidden behind the trees. Not close enough to see clearly, but enough to tell it was a person. They were standing still, facing the cabin. I could barely make out the shape, a dark outline with broad shoulders. They didn't move. I stepped back from the window, heart pounding. I turned the flashlight on and shined it outside, sweeping the trees. By the time I got it pointed toward the ravine, the figure was gone. I didn't sleep again that night. The next morning, I went outside, heart still racing. I walked around the cabin, checking the ground. There were no fresh tracks, no sign anyone had been there. I looked toward the ravine and stood there for a long time. I should have left then. I knew that, but part of me didn't want to admit I was scared. I told myself it was probably just another hiker. Someone passing through, maybe hunting, maybe lost. I didn't want to believe anything worse than that. I stayed another night. That was the mistake. That afternoon, the clouds rolled in. The wind picked up, colder than before. I kept checking the trees behind the cabin, scanning the ridge and the brush. I didn't see anything, but the feeling of being watched didn't leave me. I ate dinner early and didn't go outside after dark. I bolted the door and kept my knife beside the bed. I didn't use the light. I wanted my eyes to adjust to the dark. I lay awake, fully clothed, waiting. At around 2 in the morning, I heard the first sound. It wasn't footsteps this time. It was something tapping slow, sharp taps against the back wall of the cabin. Not the door, the wall, like something poking or knocking softly. I sat up, heart in my throat. Tap, pause, tap, tap, then silence. I stood slowly and crept toward the back window. I didn't look out. I was too afraid of what I might see. I pressed my ear to the wall. Nothing. Then something scraped. Not loud, just soft, like a stick dragging along the wood. It started at one side of the back wall and moved slowly across. Then it stopped. I stood there for maybe 10 minutes, not breathing, barely blinking. Then came the crunch. Footsteps, moving toward the front porch. Slow, steady steps. I moved silently across the room, reached the door, and pressed my eye to the small crack between the frame and the wall. I saw nothing, but I felt it. Something or someone was on the other side of the door. They didn't knock. They didn't try the handle. They just stood there. I stood there too. Minutes passed. Then finally the steps moved away. I stayed up the rest of the night, sitting on the floor with the knife in my hand and the flashlight off. When morning came, I didn't waste time. I packed everything, fast and quiet. I threw my bag into the truck, started it, and drove away without looking back. The sun was barely up, and the frost on the windshield blurred the road. I didn't stop until I reached the main road near the town. I pulled into a gas station, shaking, and sat there for a while. When I finally calmed down, I walked inside and told the guy behind the counter that someone might be trespassing up there. He nodded like it wasn't the first time he'd heard that. He said they'd send someone to check, but I didn't wait around. I drove straight home and didn't talk about it for weeks. Then one day I looked up the area online. Not the cabin listing, but the region. I found a news article from a few years ago. A man had gone missing while hiking near that same ravine. They never found a body, just his tent and some gear torn up like an animal had gotten to it. But no blood, no drag marks. Nothing conclusive. The area was known for being remote and wild. But sometimes they said people came through it. People not on maps, not in towns. Drifters. I never liked staying in cabins by myself, but that didn't stop me from doing it. Every now and then, I needed to get away from everything. Phones, people, screens, schedules, I'd hit a wall with it all. So sometimes I'd rent a remote cabin, pack some food, load up my gear, and disappear for a week. No one bothered me. I didn't even tell many people when or where I was going. That was kind of the point. This time, I found a place listed on a site that rented out private properties. It was in northern Idaho, way out near the Panhandle National Forest. The pictures showed a plain wooden cabin, one bedroom, a small kitchen, a bathroom, and a wood stove. The area looked beautiful, surrounded by trees with a lake just 10 minutes away by foot. I booked it for 6 nights, planning to hike, fish, and maybe write in my journal a bit. I arrived in the late afternoon. The road to the cabin was nothing more than a narrow gravel path off a larger Forest Service road. My tires kicked up clouds of dust as I drove in. I passed 2 old wooden signs, one with the name of the property and another warning that trespassers would be shot. Probably a joke, but the bullet holes in the second sign gave it weight. The cabin itself sat on a slight hill, backed by thick woods. No other buildings in sight. I parked my car a little downhill from the cabin and started unloading my gear. 2 coolers, dry food bins, my hiking backpack, an axe, and some tools just in case. I made several trips back and forth, beads of sweat rolling down the sides of my face even though it wasn't too hot. Inside, the place was clean but basic. A small wooden table by the window, a narrow bed in the corner with a wool blanket folded on top, and a kitchenette that ran along the far wall. The fridge was gas-powered and a bit noisy. The bathroom was small with just a toilet and a metal shower stall. A pile of split wood sat next to the stove. There was no electricity. The lights were propane with matches and instructions in a drawer. No cell service either. I liked it that way. I spent the first evening unpacking and settling in. I walked down to the lake before sunset. The trail was narrow and slightly overgrown, but not hard to follow. The water was calm, untouched. I didn't see a single soul, and that made me feel better than I expected. Back at the cabin, I cooked pasta on the propane stove and listened to the forest. The sounds at night always took a while to get used to. The creaking wood, wind through trees, sudden rustles from who knows what outside. I'd stayed in enough cabins to know the woods were alive in their own way. Still, every sound seemed to echo louder here. That first night, I didn't sleep great. It wasn't the bed, it was fine. It was more that my ears were hyper-aware. Every time the wind changed, I thought I heard something out of place. I kept telling myself it was just animals. Nothing new. Still, around 2 a.m., I got up and lit the propane lantern just to ease my nerves. I checked the lock on the door and windows. They were fine. I sat up in bed for an hour before falling back asleep. The next morning, I hiked further past the lake. I found some small animal tracks. Deer mostly, maybe a raccoon. I filled a bottle at a clear stream, filtered it, and moved deeper into the trees. Everything felt normal, peaceful. I followed a ridge that gave me a good view of the treetops below. The forest stretched out like a green ocean. Not a single person in sight. That's why what I saw next didn't make sense. About 200 feet below the ridge, I saw a man. Not walking, just standing between the trees. From that distance, I couldn't see his face. He was wearing a greenish jacket and jeans. Nothing that stood out. He wasn't moving, not even a little. At first, I thought maybe it was a hunter, but there was no gear, no backpack, no rifle, not even a walking stick. I crouched behind a log and waited, watching. He didn't move, didn't turn his head, just stood there. Eventually, I lost sight of him behind the trees. I waited 15 more minutes before heading back down the trail. I told myself it wasn't a big deal. Could have been someone else staying nearby, or even a forest worker. But the truth was, I didn't like how he was just standing there. Not walking, not looking around. Just standing perfectly still. Back at the cabin, I double-checked all the windows again. I didn't see any cars along the road when I came back. No fresh tire marks. Nothing felt off inside the cabin, but that sense of peace from earlier was gone. I kept looking over my shoulder for the rest of the day. That night, I slept even worse. Around 1 a.m., I heard something snap outside. Not a normal branch in the wind type of sound. More like the sharp crack of wood under weight. I sat up and listened. My ears rang from the silence. Then I heard it again, closer. Something heavy stepping on dry wood. I got up slowly, grabbed my flashlight, and pointed it out the small window next to the bed. Nothing, just trees swaying. But when I moved to the other window, the one by the kitchen, I froze. There were footprints in the dirt. Fresh ones right outside the window, deep and wide. I hadn't noticed them during the day, and I knew I hadn't walked there recently. I followed a narrow trail of them with my light until they disappeared near the tree line. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. I sat in the wooden chair near the stove, axe next to me, ears straining. By morning, the footprints were gone, faded or covered by forest debris. Still, I didn't feel like hiking. I stayed near the cabin. Every so often, I checked the windows. I kept looking for movement in the trees, but there was nothing. I thought about packing up and leaving early, but I didn't want to be the guy who got scared by a few noises in the woods. I was overthinking. I boiled some water and sat on the porch with my tea. As I drank, I noticed something hanging from a branch about 40 feet into the woods. A piece of fabric? No, it was a shoelace, tied to a tree branch like a marker. I hadn't seen it before, and I knew every inch of the trail around the cabin. This was new. I walked over slowly. The shoelace was tied in a strange knot, like someone had looped it in a rush. No shoe nearby, just that lace dangling like bait. I cut it down and looked around. That part of the woods was silent. No birds, no wind. The air felt still, too still. Back inside the cabin, I locked the door and shut the windows. I couldn't shake the feeling that someone had been close. Too close. I tried to nap but couldn't relax. I kept remembering that guy I saw from the ridge. The way he didn't move. The footprints. The shoelace. That night, I blocked the door with the table and put a chair under the window handle. I turned off the lantern early and sat in the dark, listening. At some point, I dozed off in the chair. I don't know how long I was out, but I woke up with a sharp jolt. There was a sound, soft but deliberate. Not wind, not a branch, more like a slow step on gravel. Then another. Someone was outside. I didn't move. I held my breath, ears straining. The steps moved along the front porch, then stopped. Nothing. Then the sound of metal tapping wood. Once, then again. It was the doorknob. I stood slowly, heart pounding so loud I couldn't hear much else. I grabbed the axe and moved to the side of the door, breathing shallow. Whoever was out there didn't try to open the door, just tapped it. Then I heard something even worse. Breathing, just outside the door. Heavy, like someone standing close to the wood. Just breathing. I didn't move for 20 minutes. I swear I stood frozen in that spot, not blinking. Eventually, the breathing stopped. Then footsteps slowly faded away into the woods. I stayed up the rest of the night, axe in hand. I didn't dare open the door until it was light out. In the morning, I stepped out cautiously. I didn't see anyone, but I did see something else. There was a single rock on the porch right by the door. A small, perfectly round stone that hadn't been there before. And next to it, in the dirt, were 2 fresh boot prints. Whoever was out there wasn't trying to break in. They were trying to scare me, toying with me, watching me. I went back inside, packed everything I could in 20 minutes, and left without breakfast. As I drove out, I kept checking the trees, looking for a green jacket, a still figure. I didn't see him, but an hour down the road, I stopped at a ranger station and reported it. They said they'd send someone to check the area. Maybe they did, maybe they didn't. No one ever called me back. That was 3 years ago. Since then, I've stayed away from cabins. I still hike, still fish, but I never stay alone in the woods anymore. Because I don't think that man was a drifter or a hiker. He was hunting something, and that night it might have been me. He didn't want to break in. He didn't want to rob me. He wanted me to know he was out there, and he wanted me to leave scared. It worked. It started when I needed a break from the noise. I'd been living in the city too long. Cars, sirens, people yelling at all hours. I was burnt out. My job kept piling up more responsibilities, and the walls of my apartment felt like they were closing in. I needed silence, fresh air, and to be far away from everything. I found a cabin online. It was deep in the woods of Montana. Old, but looked solid from the pictures. 1 bedroom with stove, solar panels, a water pump. The listing said it was 20 miles from the nearest town and could only be reached by a narrow dirt road. I booked it for 3 weeks. I drove out there in my pickup. Took 2 days. The last stretch of the road was rough and barely wide enough for the truck, winding up through thick pine forest. There were no signs, no cell service, just trees. When I pulled up to the cabin, it looked even more isolated than I expected. Old wood, dark stain, tin roof. No other cabins, no people. Nothing but forest in every direction. The first few days were exactly what I needed. I chopped wood, read books, went on short hikes, cooked simple meals. The air smelled clean, and the wind in the trees made a sound I hadn't heard in years. That deep, swaying whisper. I slept better than I had in months. No phone, no internet. Just me, the forest, and time. Then something started to feel off. I can't explain when it began. It was slow. At first, I thought I was just adjusting to being alone. But there were little things. Like one night, I came back from a short hike to find the door slightly open. I was sure I had latched it. There were scratch marks near the base of it too. I thought maybe a raccoon tried to get in. I checked inside. Nothing was disturbed. Then I noticed my bag had been moved. Not opened, just shifted to the other side of the couch. I told myself I must have moved it and forgot. I wanted to believe that. After a week, I started waking up in the middle of the night, feeling like something had brushed against the side of the cabin. It wasn't wind. It was a dull thud, or the sound of weight shifting against wood. I got up with my flashlight each time, checked outside. I never saw anything, but I started to feel watched. There was a small shed about 50 feet from the cabin. It was empty when I arrived. Just a few tools, a rusted gas can, some rope. One morning, I walked past it and noticed the rope was hanging from one of the ceiling beams now. It had been on the floor before. It was tied in a knot, not just looped, but tied like a noose. I untied it and tossed it back on the ground. I didn't sleep well after that. The next night, I sat up in bed for hours, listening. The forest was too quiet. No owls, no crickets. I kept the fire going low just to have some light. Around 2 a.m., I heard what sounded like a footstep on the porch. Just one. I froze. I waited, ears straining. Nothing followed. I grabbed the axe I kept by the woodpile and crept toward the door. I didn't open it. I waited, then looked through the tiny window. Nothing was there. I stayed awake until sunrise. When I stepped outside, I saw the step had dirt on it. Partial boot print. It wasn't mine. The shape was different, wider, with deeper treads. That shook me. I walked around the cabin with the axe in hand, heart pounding. The woods looked empty, but something was out there. I considered leaving, but I told myself it was probably a hunter. Maybe someone got lost and came by. It was public land. Still, I started locking the door with a heavy wooden bar from the inside. I didn't hike far anymore, just around the perimeter of the cabin. I kept the axe closer. About 10 days in, I found something that made my blood run cold. I was walking near the shed again and saw something nailed to a tree. It was a photograph, old, black and white. It had a thumbtack pinning it through the top corner. The picture was of the cabin, my cabin, but it looked older, and there were two people standing in front of it. One looked like a man, tall and thin. The other smaller, maybe a woman or a child. Their faces were hard to make out, blurred or faded. I took the photo back inside and examined it. On the back, in pencil, someone had written, "Gone missing, October 1987. That was nearly 40 years ago. I had no idea who they were. I searched the cabin for more pictures or notes but found nothing. That same day, I noticed a pile of stones arranged behind the shed. 6 small rocks stacked carefully, like a marker. It hadn't been there before. The feeling of being watched grew worse. I'd sit on the porch during the day and scan the trees. Sometimes I thought I saw movement, just a quick shift of shadows. But when I stared, there was nothing. I stopped going outside at night. One evening, the sun was going down and I was stacking wood inside near the stove when I heard a creak. Not from the walls or the wind. It was the floorboards, from the back of the cabin. The hair on my arms stood up. I turned slowly, axe in hand. The back door was closed, still latched. I walked quietly, every step cautious. I checked the small back room. Nothing, but the window was open an inch. I hadn't opened it. That night, I barely slept. I kept the axe next to my sleeping bag and propped a chair against the door. At one point, I thought I heard whispering, faint, low, but it stopped as soon as I sat up. The forest outside was silent again. By the next morning, I was sure someone was messing with me. I packed up my gear, ready to leave early. But when I turned the ignition in the truck, it clicked and nothing happened. I tried again. Nothing. I popped the hood. The battery cables were fine. I checked the tank. Still had gas. But someone had cut a line under the truck. Clean slice. I was trapped. I spent that day with adrenaline running through my veins. I kept the axe in my hand even inside. I ate cold food, checked the windows constantly. That night, I lit every candle I had and didn't sleep. I sat against the door with my back to it. Around 3 a.m., I heard something scrape across the porch. A dragging sound, then a slow knock. Just 3 knocks. Soft but deliberate. I didn't move. I waited, holding my breath. I didn't respond. After a long minute, the sound of retreating footsteps crunched away into the forest. In the morning, I went outside and found something waiting on the porch. It was my photograph, the same one I found on the tree, but now it had a red X drawn over the cabin in thick ink. That was enough. I needed to get out of there. I had no choice but to walk. I packed light, brought water, snacks, the axe, and a compass. I locked the cabin behind me and took off down the dirt road. I walked fast, checking behind me often. Every sound in the forest felt louder. Every branch that snapped made me spin around, but the forest stayed quiet. After a few hours, I heard something ahead, a low humming, almost like an engine. I moved toward it and saw a small trail leading off the road. At the end was an old camper, covered in a tarp. I approached slowly. No one answered when I knocked on the side. I called out. No answer. I peeked through the curtain. Inside was a bed, a table, and shelves of canned food. But no one. I didn't go in. I didn't touch anything. I backed away and kept walking. That evening, I reached the edge of the forest. I saw a paved road in the distance. I made it to a small gas station just as the sun was going down. The clerk looked surprised to see someone come out of the woods. I didn't tell him the full story, just asked to use the phone. In the weeks after, I told the police. They sent someone out, but said the cabin looked untouched. The rope, the photo, the truck, none of it could be explained. There were no prints, no signs of anyone else. They said it could have been an old prank or an animal. But I know what I felt. I know someone was out there, watching, waiting, and they wanted me gone. I never went back. I never will. That place isn't empty. It never was. Sometimes late at night, I still think about that photo, about the red X, about those missing people. And I wonder if whoever took them was still there, watching from the woods as I slept, waiting for me to stay one day longer. I'm just glad I didn't. I was burned out from work, sitting in front of a screen all day, answering emails, drowning in tasks that never seemed to end. My head was pounding constantly, and the days just blended into each other. So I decided I needed a break. Proper one. No hotels, no tourists. Just me and some space. I found a cabin online that was a couple of hours from the city, somewhere deep in the woods, far from any towns. The photos showed a small wooden place beside a lake, with thick trees all around. It looked perfect. Isolated, quiet, peaceful. I packed light. Just a duffel bag with some clothes, a cooler with food, a flashlight, a first aid kit, and some basic tools. I also brought a camp stove, even though the cabin was supposed to have a working kitchen. I like being prepared. I left early on Friday morning. The road was long and winding, and as I got further from the city, cell signal began to fade. Eventually, there was no signal at all. The last stretch was a gravel road that led into the trees. My tires kicked up dust and small rocks, and I didn't pass a single car. By the time I got there, the sun was just starting to dip behind the trees. The cabin was smaller than it looked in the pictures, but it was clean. There was a tiny dock by the lake, and the water was still. The air smelled like pine and damp wood. I unlocked the door with the code the owner had given me and stepped inside. It was simple. One main room with a bed, a couch, and a kitchen area. There was a small bathroom in the corner. No TV, no Wi-Fi, just silence. It was exactly what I needed. That first night, I sat out on the small porch and watched the water reflect the darkening sky. Crickets chirped, and the wind moved through the trees. I felt calm for the first time in months. I read for a bit, then went to sleep early. The bed was a little firm, but I was so tired I barely noticed. The next morning, I woke up around 6. I made coffee on the stove and sat out on the dock with a book. The lake had mist rising off it, and everything felt fresh and untouched. I explored a little after breakfast, walking around the edge of the water, checking out the thick trees and uneven paths. I didn't go too far. I didn't want to get lost. There were no signs, no markers, just endless woods. Around midday, I made lunch and rested. I wrote in my journal something I hadn't done in years. Time moved slowly out here. I liked it. The only sounds were birds and the occasional rustling of small animals in the undergrowth. That afternoon, I tried fishing with the small rod I had brought, but I didn't catch anything. I didn't care. I wasn't here for that. That night, it got cold. I made sure the windows were shut tight and added an extra blanket to the bed. I heard an owl hooting outside, and once I thought I heard something larger crunching in the leaves, but it passed quickly. I figured it was just a deer. The next morning, things started to feel a little different. When I went outside, I noticed the door to the shed near the cabin was slightly open. I was sure it had been closed when I arrived. It was one of those metal sheds with a latch but no lock. I walked over and looked inside. There wasn't much, just a rusted rake, a few cracked flower pots, and an old broom. Nothing looked out of place, but the fact that it was open unsettled me. I closed it again and pushed the latch down firmly. I spent most of the day trying to ignore that small unease. I hiked a little farther than before, keeping track of where I stepped and what I passed. At one point, I came across a deer skull on the ground. It was picked clean but not old. The bones were still white, and there were bits of fur clinging to it. I stared at it for a while, then turned around and walked back. That night, I had trouble sleeping. Every creak of the wooden walls made my ears twitch. The wind felt stronger, and the trees outside groaned against each other. At around 2 in the morning, I sat up in bed. I thought I heard something outside. A thump, soft but clear, near the back of the cabin. I held still, listening. Then another, like someone stepping heavily on the porch. I didn't have a gun, but I grabbed the heavy flashlight from beside the bed. I crept toward the door, moving as quietly as I could. I turned off the lights so I wouldn't be seen through the windows. The front porch was empty. I opened the door slowly and shined the beam out into the dark. The trees swayed. The lake reflected the moon. Nothing. I checked around the cabin. No tracks, no sign of anything. I tried to tell myself it was a branch falling or an animal bumping something. I went back inside, locked the door, and stayed in bed until sunrise. The next day, I checked the area again. There were no prints, but the ground was hard and dry, so that wasn't surprising. I noticed the shed door was open again, this time wide. I felt a cold tightness in my chest. I walked over and saw the broom had been moved. It was now leaning against the inside wall, not flat on the floor like before. I hadn't touched it. I stood there a while, just looking. Then I closed the shed, went back to the cabin, and dragged one of the kitchen chairs against the front door. It was a stupid thing to do, maybe, but it made me feel a little better. That evening, it rained. Hard. Thunder rumbled in the distance. The wind picked up, and the lake was no longer smooth. I stayed inside and tried to read, but I couldn't focus. Every time the rain slapped the windows, I flinched. I made dinner, forced myself to eat, and tried to act like everything was normal. At some point, the power flickered. Then it went out completely. I cursed under my breath. The owner had warned this might happen during a storm. I found my flashlight and lit one of the small candles from the kitchen drawer. The soft light moved shadows around the room. I sat on the couch and stared at the window. Water ran down the glass in long, steady lines. It was after midnight when I heard the knock. It was a soft sound, just one knock, then silence. I sat frozen. Came again, slightly louder, then again. 3 knocks, then quiet. The chair was still against the door. I hadn't moved it. I picked up the flashlight and waited. I didn't move for 10 minutes. Nothing else happened. I didn't sleep that night. In the morning, I found muddy prints on the side of the cabin. Not shoe prints, bare feet. I checked the shed again. The broom was gone. The rake was leaning against the wall. My heart pounded as I backed away slowly. I packed up my things. I didn't care that I had one more night booked. I loaded everything into the car and started driving. I didn't look back. Not once. I didn't stop until I saw a gas station with working lights. I bought coffee with shaky hands and used their bathroom to splash water on my face. That night, I stayed at a motel near the edge of the city. I double-locked the door and left the bathroom light on. The next day, I emailed the cabin owner. I didn't go into detail. I just said something came up and I had to leave early. They didn't ask any questions. A week later, I got curious. I searched for the address online again. I found the original listing. Still there. Still up for rent. Still the same photos. I clicked around and found some older reviews. One of them stood out. It was from a guy who had stayed there the year before. He said the cabin was nice, peaceful, but he had cut his trip short. He said he kept hearing things outside at night. He said the shed kept opening on its own. That review was the last one posted. I haven't gone back to the woods since. It started as a weekend trip to a secluded cabin in the woods, something I had wanted to do for a while. I found the cabin online, listed on a forum where people shared hidden places for solitude. The guy who posted it didn't say much, just that it was clean, had running water, and nobody went out there anymore. That was exactly what I wanted: quiet, peace, and no people. The drive took about 6 hours. The last hour was rough, though. I had to take my old pickup over narrow dirt roads that twisted through thick forest. My GPS stopped working halfway through, so I relied on a printed map I brought just in case. The trees got denser the deeper I went, and sunlight barely touched the ground. It was early autumn, and most leaves had turned orange and red. It would have looked beautiful if the air hadn't felt so still. It was the kind of silence where you feel like you're being watched, even when you know no one is around. I arrived late afternoon. The cabin was smaller than I expected, but it looked sturdy. Made of dark logs, it had a slanted tin roof and one small porch. A thin chimney stuck out the top, and there was a pile of split wood stacked neatly along the side. I walked around it first, making sure there were no signs of damage. Everything looked solid. No broken windows, the door was locked, and the roof looked recently repaired. There was even a trail behind it that led toward the woods. Inside, it was simple but clean. One room with a bed, a small wood stove, a table, 2 chairs, and a few shelves. There was a door leading to a tiny bathroom with a composting toilet and a sink hooked up to a rainwater tank. I set my bags down, opened a few windows for air, and unpacked. I brought dry food, a few gallons of drinking water, a flashlight, a small battery-powered lantern, a book, and my old hunting knife. I didn't plan on needing much. That first night was quiet. I sat on the porch and watched the woods. I could hear the wind moving through the trees and an occasional rustling in the brush. Probably deer. I went to bed early, falling asleep with that deep sense of tiredness that comes from a long drive. I woke up around 2 a.m. to a sound outside. It was faint, like a soft crunching of leaves. I sat up, heart beating a little faster. I listened for a few minutes. It stopped. I figured it was some animal moving around and went back to sleep. The next morning, I walked around the cabin and saw faint footprints in the dirt. They weren't fresh, and they could have been mine from the day before, but I couldn't be sure. I let it go. I made breakfast, sat on the porch, and enjoyed the quiet. I didn't see any people. No planes in the sky, no cars in the distance. Nothing. Just trees and more trees. Later that afternoon, I followed the trail behind the cabin. It wasn't overgrown, which was strange. Someone must have walked it recently. It led uphill for a while before curving toward a dry creek bed. I walked for about half an hour before heading back. I didn't want to get lost. That night, it got windy. I sat inside, reading by lantern light. Around midnight, the wind stopped suddenly, like someone turned it off. Then I heard something outside again. This time it was louder. Heavy steps in the leaves. I turned off the lantern and sat still. The steps came closer, then stopped. I waited, holding my breath. Nothing happened. After a long time, I turned the lantern back on and stayed awake until morning. When the sun came up, I checked around the cabin. No signs of anything. No footprints, no marks, nothing moved. I started to feel like I was imagining it. Still, I couldn't shake the unease. I kept the knife with me from then on. The third day, I decided to explore the trail again. I followed it farther this time, down into the creek bed and up the other side. About an hour in, I found something that made me stop cold. A tree, stripped of bark in a wide circle, chest high. Around it, the ground had been disturbed, like something large had moved through the area. I looked for claw marks or animal tracks, but didn't see any. I backed away slowly and returned to the cabin. That night, the noises came back. This time, they circled the cabin. I sat in the dark again, listening. I could hear slow, heavy steps moving around outside. Then I heard a soft scrape against the wall, like fingernails or claws dragging across wood. I stayed in bed, knife in hand, heart pounding. It lasted almost an hour. In the morning, I found scratches on the back wall of the cabin. 3 long lines, spaced wide. Not like any animal I knew. Too wide for a bear. Too deliberate. That was the first time I seriously thought about leaving. But I told myself I was overreacting. I tried to calm down and spent the day chopping wood and doing anything to keep busy. On the fourth night, something changed. I was sitting on the porch at dusk, watching the treeline. I saw movement, not an animal. It was upright, a figure, not close but not far either. It stood still, half hidden behind trees. I couldn't make out details, just the shape. It watched for a while, then vanished into the woods. I went inside, locked the door, and blocked it with the table. I didn't sleep. I sat there in the dark with my knife and flashlight, waiting. I didn't hear anything, but I kept seeing shadows outside. Once, I thought I saw the figure again, but it was gone before I could focus. At sunrise, I packed. I wasn't staying another night. I loaded everything into the truck and started the engine. As I pulled away, I looked back at the cabin. Nothing unusual, just the same quiet place. But the feeling stayed with me. The drive back was harder. The forest seemed tighter. I kept looking in the rearview mirror. At one point, I stopped to stretch and saw what looked like footprints in the dirt behind my truck. Big ones, barefoot. I got back in and drove faster. When I reached town, I didn't stop. I kept going until I hit the highway. I only felt safe once I saw other cars again. I drove straight home and didn't talk to anyone for a few days. I never went back. I didn't report anything. What could I say? That something walked around my cabin at night? That I saw a figure in the woods? There were no pictures, no proof. But I know what I felt. I know what I heard. Something was out there. Something that didn't want me there. Months later, I checked that forum again. The post about the cabin was gone. I looked through old screenshots I had saved, but the username didn't show up anymore, like it had never been there. I still think about it sometimes. When I'm out walking alone or when the wind dies suddenly, I think about the scratches, the footprints, the figure in the woods, and I know I wasn't alone out there. I haven't gone back into the woods since. I'm not the kind of person who takes big risks. I live a quiet life. I work from home. I eat the same breakfast almost every day, and I don't really like traveling unless I know exactly what I'm walking into. But last September, I broke my own routine. I had gotten burned out from work. I do freelance graphic design, and for almost 3 months straight, I barely had a day off. My eyes were dry all the time. My neck was always sore. I was sleeping 5 hours a night, drinking too much coffee, and never leaving my apartment except for groceries. I started feeling like I was floating through my days. I'd sit there and just blink and hours would pass. So I told myself I needed to get away, not for fun, just to shut everything off for a bit. No internet, no deadlines, no noise, just a quiet place to sleep and stare at trees. I started looking for a remote cabin on some rental websites. I wanted something far from people, maybe in the woods where I could hike a little, read, cook, and reset my brain. I found one that looked perfect. It was in northern Minnesota, not too far from the Canadian border. The listing said it was deep in the woods, completely off-grid, with solar power for lights and a wood stove for heat. No Wi-Fi, no neighbors, just a small lake nearby and miles of trees. The cabin looked clean and solid. Small, single-story, wood exterior, tin roof. It had one bedroom, a small kitchen, a sitting area with a couch, and a shed out back for firewood. The reviews were all short but good. Most people just said it was quiet, peaceful, and exactly what they needed. That was enough for me. I booked it for 8 nights. I packed warm clothes, some simple groceries, 2 flashlights, my pocket knife, and a few paperbacks. I drove up from St. Paul over the course of a day and arrived in the afternoon. The road turned from pavement to gravel, then to dirt. It got narrower and narrower until it was barely wide enough for my car. There were no street signs, no houses, just tall pines on both sides. The final stretch was bumpy. I had to crawl along at 5 miles an hour to avoid scraping the bottom of my car. Finally, I reached a small clearing with the cabin sitting quietly at the edge of the trees. It was exactly like the pictures. Small, gray wood siding, dark windows, and a simple wooden porch. There was no driveway, just grass and a few big rocks. I parked in front, got out, and looked around. The silence was strange. No traffic sounds, no planes, no wind even, just stillness. I could hear my own breath. I let myself in using the lockbox code the owner had emailed me. Inside, everything was in order. Smelled like old wood and dust, but it was clean. There was a narrow bed in the bedroom, some old wool blankets, and a few hooks on the walls. The bathroom had a composting toilet and a little sink hooked to a rain barrel system. I unpacked slowly and walked through the place to get familiar. That first night was uneventful. I made a simple dinner on the small gas stove, read a few chapters from my book, and went to bed early. The air was cold and still. I could hear every creak of the wood. I wasn't used to it, but it didn't bother me. It just felt old. The first few days passed like that. I hiked a bit, took photos of the lake, collected firewood, and just sat out on the porch with tea in my hand, breathing in the silence. I saw a few deer, some squirrels, and even heard a coyote one night in the distance. It was peaceful in a raw kind of way, isolated but not scary. But then something changed around the fourth night. It started with a sound. I had gone to bed around 10 p.m. I had a fire going in the stove to keep the place warm, and I was lying under a heavy blanket, drifting off. That's when I heard something outside. A light crunch, like a footstep on frozen leaves. I opened my eyes and waited. I heard it again, a little closer. Crunch. Pause. Crunch. I sat up and listened hard. It was completely dark outside. No moon that night. I reached for my flashlight and quietly stood up. I went to the window and looked out. Nothing. Just blackness. I didn't go outside. I wasn't that stupid. But I stayed at the window for a while, listening. After a few minutes, I didn't hear anything else. I went back to bed, thinking maybe it had been a deer. The next day was cloudy and colder. I tried to brush it off, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. I looked around the yard but didn't see any tracks. Still, I stayed close to the cabin and kept my knife in my pocket. That night, I made sure to lock the door and pull the curtain across the window. Around 2 a.m., I woke up to another sound. This time it was a sharp tap, like something hitting the window glass. I froze. Came again. Tap. Then silence. I didn't move. I just lay there in the dark, listening. My flashlight was on the table beside me, but I didn't reach for it. I just stared at the ceiling, breathing slow, trying to stay quiet. Eventually, I must have fallen asleep again. In the morning, I checked the window. Nothing there. No smudges, no scratches, no rocks. Just dirt and pine needles outside. I didn't go hiking that day. I stayed on the porch with a book and kept glancing up every few minutes. Nothing happened, but I couldn't relax. The silence now felt heavier. That evening, while I was chopping a few pieces of firewood, I saw something that made my stomach drop. Out past the trees, maybe 100 feet from the cabin, something was hanging from a branch. I thought it was a bag or trash, maybe caught in the wind. But when I walked a little closer, I realized it was a dead bird. Its wings were spread out like it had been pinned. Its neck looked broken, twisted sideways. I stood there for a while, trying to understand what I was seeing. I didn't want to touch it. I just turned and walked back. That night, I didn't sleep much. I kept the flashlight beside me and my knife under the pillow. Every small sound made my heart beat faster. Around 3 a.m., I heard something on the porch. A soft thud, then slow steps, then nothing. I stayed completely still, trying to control my breathing. I didn't look out the window. I didn't move until the sun came up. That morning, I found something strange. There were muddy footprints on the porch. They were bare feet, no shoes, no boots, just wet, dirty prints leading up to the front door, stopping right at the welcome mat. Then they turned around and went back into the woods. I stood there staring at them for a long time. I didn't know what to do. I was too far from town. I had no cell signal, no landline. I thought about packing up and leaving, but I wasn't even sure my car would make it out fast on those roads, especially if something went wrong. So I stayed, but I didn't sleep again. The next night, I stayed up late with all the lights on. I sat at the table with my back to the wall, flashlight in my hand, eyes on the window. Around 1 a.m., I saw movement, just a quick shape moving past the window. I stood up slowly and waited. Then another movement. This time I saw it more clearly. A man, thin, pale, no shirt. He was walking slowly around the cabin. I didn't move. I stayed perfectly still. He stopped at the window looking in. I stayed frozen. He stood there for maybe 10 seconds, then moved away. I waited a long time. Then I crept over, peeked through the side window. He was gone. I didn't sleep. I stayed up until daylight. The next day, I packed everything. I threw all my stuff in the car without organizing it. I started the engine and drove as fast as I could without wrecking my car. The road felt longer on the way out. Every branch that brushed against the side of the car made me flinch. I didn't stop until I hit pavement. I didn't even look back. When I got to a gas station an hour later, I finally checked my phone. I had dozens of missed notifications, emails, texts, alerts. I didn't care. I just drove home. I never told anyone about it. Not really. What would I say? Some barefoot guy was stalking my cabin? No one would believe me. There were no pictures, no evidence, just those footprints, the bird, and that feeling in my chest I can't forget. I didn't go back for the refund. I didn't leave a review. I still don't know what that man was doing out there, or how long he had been watching the cabin. Maybe he lived out there. Maybe he waits for people like me, people who want to be alone. I don't care. I will never go to a cabin in the woods again, ever. I was looking for a break. Not the kind of break where you spend too much money and stay in a hotel with a view of the ocean, but the kind where you just disappear for a little while. Somewhere quiet, somewhere no one knew me. I had been dealing with too many things at once. Work deadlines, an apartment full of noise, bills piling up, and the constant pressure of being available online 24/7. I wanted out, just for a week. I found a cabin on an old listing website. It didn't have many reviews, and the photos were clearly taken years ago. But it was cheap and far from everything. Tucked somewhere in the hills of West Virginia, surrounded by woods and not much else. The owner had left a short description. It mentioned that the cabin was off-grid and rustic, with no Wi-Fi, spotty cell reception, and a wood stove for heat. Perfect. I booked it for 6 nights. The drive took longer than I expected. I left early in the morning, but the roads got worse the deeper I went. At some point, my GPS lost connection, and I had to rely on printed directions I had written down as a backup. The last part of the drive was a narrow dirt road, full of potholes and lined with thick trees on both sides. Every few minutes, I had to slow down to avoid bottoming out. I didn't see another car the entire time. When I finally arrived, it was already late afternoon. The cabin looked older than the pictures, but not in a dangerous way. Just weathered. It had a slanted tin roof, faded wood panels, and a small porch out front. There were no neighbors in sight, just a forest that stretched on forever. And behind the cabin, a steep trail that led down to what the listing called an abandoned rock quarry. Inside, the place was small. One main room with a bed, a table, and a kitchen area. There was a tiny bathroom with a compost toilet and a sink that ran cold water from a rain barrel outside. There was no electricity, just oil lamps and a wood stove. I set my bags down and opened all the windows to let in the fresh air. The silence hit me right away. No cars, no people, no phones buzzing. Just birds and the occasional breeze shaking the trees. The first night was peaceful. I made a small fire in the stove, cooked a can of soup, and read a paperback by lantern light. When I stepped outside before bed, the sky was pitch black, full of stars. The kind of stars you forget exist when you live in the city too long. I stood there for a long time just breathing it in. But things started to feel strange the next day. It started with a sound, a low, dull thud that echoed through the trees sometime in the morning. I was sitting on the porch with a cup of coffee when I heard it. It wasn't close, but it was heavy, like something big had dropped a few hundred yards away. I waited, thinking maybe a tree had fallen, but there was no crash, just that single thud. Then it happened again that afternoon. Same sound, same direction. I got curious and followed it down the trail behind the cabin. The path was narrow and overgrown, but it was clear people had used it before. It took me about 15 minutes to reach the bottom where the trees opened up into a wide, circular pit. The quarry. The quarry looked like a huge bite had been taken out of the earth. The sides were steep, rocky walls, and at the very bottom was a shallow pool of water. Some rusty metal parts were scattered around, old mining equipment maybe. There was also a shed near the edge of the pit, covered in vines and leaning to one side like it could fall at any moment. I didn't stay long. The place gave me a weird feeling, and I hadn't brought water or anything. I turned back and hiked up the hill. That night, the thud came again, louder this time. I sat up in bed, my ears tuned into the dark. Nothing followed it. No animal sounds, no breaking branches. Just the sound and then silence. I tried to sleep, but every time I drifted off, I thought I heard something else. Something softer, like movement. Light footsteps outside the window. I told myself it was just an animal and eventually fell asleep. The next morning, I went back down to the quarry. I felt like I had to know what was making that noise. I walked the full loop around the edge of the pit. The shed was even more broken down than I remembered. The door had fallen off, and the inside was full of old tools and broken wooden crates. Some animal tracks were in the mud near the water, but nothing big enough to make that kind of thud. As I was about to leave, I noticed something odd. What looked like a metal ring sticking out of the dirt behind the shed. I cleared some leaves and found a trapdoor. It was made of old wood and had metal handles. My first thought was that it led to a storage space or maybe an old shelter. I didn't open it. Something about it felt wrong. It was partially buried and had clearly been there for decades. I headed back to the cabin and tried to shake the feeling that something was off. But I couldn't. That night, I didn't hear the thud, but something worse happened. I woke up to the sound of footsteps on the porch. Slow, deliberate. I lay frozen in bed, staring at the ceiling, trying to tell myself it was just a deer or raccoon. Then I heard the creak of the floorboards near the door. It stopped. I waited for what felt like forever, heart pounding, mouth dry. I didn't move. After what felt like an hour, I finally fell back asleep, probably from pure exhaustion. In the morning, I checked the porch. No tracks, nothing out of place. But when I looked at the side of the cabin, near the window by the bed, I saw something that made my stomach drop. Scratches on the wall. Thin, shallow lines in the wood, like someone had dragged a stick or knife across it. They weren't deep, but they were fresh. I told myself I had to leave early. I had 4 nights left, but I couldn't take it anymore. I packed up and planned to drive out after lunch. But when I got in the car and turned the key, nothing happened. The engine didn't even click. I popped the hood, checked the battery, it looked fine. I had no tools and no way to fix it. My phone had 0 signal. I was stuck. I sat in the cabin the rest of the day, jumping at every sound. As night fell, I moved the table and chair in front of the door and kept the lantern burning. I didn't sleep. Around 2 a.m., the thud came again. This time it was followed by something new, a dragging sound. It was faint but steady, like something heavy was being pulled across the ground. It circled the cabin. I sat on the bed, holding a kitchen knife I'd brought from the drawer, my hands shaking. The dragging stopped right outside the window, then silence. When the sun came up, I ran down the trail to the quarry. I don't even know why. Maybe I thought I could hide. Maybe I thought I'd find something that explained what was going on. When I reached the shed, I saw the trapdoor again. This time it was open. There was a wooden ladder leading down into a dark tunnel.
Ursäkta veveran.
I should have gone back to the road and walked for miles if I had to, but something pulled me toward it. I climbed down. The tunnel was damp and cold. It smelled like dirt and rot. The walls were rough stone. After about 20 feet, it opened into a larger room. And that's when I saw them, bones. Animal bones. Dozens of them, scattered across the floor. Some big, some small. All picked clean. In the corner was a pile of cloth, old clothes maybe, torn and stained. I turned to leave, but then I saw something else. Scratches, like the ones on my cabin. Dozens of them carved into the stone walls. Some shallow, some deep, like someone or something had been trapped down there. I climbed out as fast as I could and ran back to the cabin. I stayed inside all day, knife in hand. I didn't eat. I didn't drink. Just waited for morning. When it came, I grabbed my pack and walked. I left the car behind. I walked for 7 hours until I found a gas station by the highway. I must have looked like a mess. Dirty, tired, eyes wild. They gave me water and let me call a tow truck. I told them my car broke down. I didn't mention anything else. The truck driver took me back. The cabin was just as I left it, but something had changed. Near the back porch, there were deep marks in the dirt. Not tire tracks, not animal prints, just drag marks, like something had been pulled out of the woods and toward the quarry. I never went back. I sold the car. I deleted the listing. I don't even know if the cabin is still there. I don't know what I heard out there. I don't know what was in that tunnel. But I do know this: some places are better left alone, and some doors should stay buried. I was 31 when I decided to spend a week alone at a remote cabin deep in the woods of northern Idaho. I had been living in the city for too long, and everything about my life felt like noise. Phones ringing, emails piling up, meetings stacked on top of each other. I needed a break. I needed silence and space to think. A friend of a friend owned this cabin and agreed to let me stay there as long as I brought my own supplies and left it clean. There was no internet, no cell service, and the nearest town was a 2-hour drive through mountain roads. I drove up in my old SUV, packed with everything I thought I would need: canned food, water, a sleeping bag, a hunting knife, a hatchet, and a few books. The cabin was about 6 miles off a logging trail, and the last 2 miles were only accessible by foot or ATV. I parked where the road ended and hiked the last stretch, pulling my supplies in a plastic sled. It was early October. The trees were turning orange and red, and the air was cold but dry. The forest was quiet in that way that feels heavy, like even the birds were holding their breath. The cabin itself was simple, old but solid. A small one-room building with a wood stove, a bunk, a tiny kitchen area with a hand pump for water, and a composting toilet in an outhouse about 20 feet behind it. There were no lights except for a few battery-powered lanterns. I unloaded everything, set up my sleeping bag, and made a small fire in the stove. That first night I felt good, like I had made the right decision. The next few days passed slowly. I would wake up, make instant coffee, read for hours, hike the trails around the cabin, chop wood, and sit on the porch doing nothing. The silence was strange at first, but I got used to it. I even started to enjoy it. No traffic, no people talking, no hum of machines. Just the sound of wind moving through the trees and the occasional creak of the cabin settling. It was the 4th night when something changed. I had gone to bed around 9 p.m. The wood stove was crackling softly. I was dozing off when I heard what sounded like someone stepping on dry leaves outside. It was faint but distinct. At first, I thought it might be a deer or maybe a raccoon, but then the footsteps stopped just outside the door. They didn't move. They didn't retreat. They just stopped. I sat up slowly, trying not to make any noise. I didn't turn on the lantern. My hunting knife was next to the bed, and I grabbed it quietly. I waited. Nothing happened. No knocking, no voice, no more footsteps. Just silence. After about 10 minutes, I finally convinced myself it had been an animal. Maybe it had paused and then walked off so quietly I didn't hear it. Eventually, I lay back down and forced myself to sleep. The next morning, I went outside to check around the cabin. The ground was covered in leaves, but I noticed a few spots where they had been disturbed, like someone had stepped through. The trail led from the forest to the cabin and then back again. I couldn't tell how big the footprints were, but they didn't look like hooves. They looked human. That was the first time I felt a real sense of unease. Still, I told myself it was probably a hunter who got lost or curious. I didn't want to overreact. That day, I didn't go for a hike. I stayed near the cabin, chopping wood and listening. Everything felt different. I kept looking over my shoulder. The trees seemed closer somehow. That night, I built the fire up higher and double-checked the lock on the door. I put the hunting knife under my pillow. Around midnight, I woke up to a thump on the side of the cabin. Not a small one, It was like someone had hit the wall with their hand or maybe kicked it. I sat up instantly, heart pounding, knife in hand. Then I heard it again. A second thump, this time on the back wall near the outhouse. I didn't move. I just listened. More footsteps, this time circling the cabin slowly. Then nothing. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. I sat in the dark, back against the wall, knife on my knee, listening for anything. But it stayed quiet. When the sun came up, I finally felt brave enough to go outside. Again, the leaves had been disturbed. I followed them about 30 yards into the woods before they just stopped. No trail, no prints in the dirt, nothing, just forest. That morning, I seriously considered packing up and leaving. But I was 2 miles from my car, and the thought of walking through the forest while someone might be watching me was worse than staying put. I decided to wait until the next morning and leave at first light. I spent the rest of the day on edge. I kept the knife with me at all times. I didn't cook anything. I didn't want any smells attracting animals or people. When the sun started to set, I brought everything valuable inside and locked the door tight. I barely slept. Every creak of the wood or gust of wind made me jump. But the night passed without anything happening. The next morning, I packed everything into the sled and set off toward my car as soon as it was light enough to see. I kept looking back, scanning the trees. The forest felt wrong. Not just scary, but hostile, like it wanted me gone. I reached the car without seeing anyone, loaded up, and drove out of there as fast as I could. I didn't stop until I reached the next town. When I got home, I told myself I was being paranoid, that it was just the isolation getting to me, that maybe it was just a hunter or someone messing around. But 2 days later, I got a call from the friend who had given me access to the cabin. He said something had happened. A hiker found the cabin door ripped open. The lock was broken, the inside was trashed. My gear was still gone, but there were deep gashes in the wood near the door, like someone had tried to break in with a tool. The woods around the cabin had signs of someone camping out recently. A makeshift lean-to shelter, a small pile of trash, and footprints all around. The police checked it out but said it was probably a squatter or some survivalist. They didn't find anyone. They didn't have any leads. But my friend told me something that made my stomach turn. He said the footprints weren't just recent. They had been there a while. Some were older, partly covered in leaves, going back and forth between the shelter and the cabin. Whoever it was had been watching me the whole time I was there. After that, I didn't sleep right for months. I kept checking the locks on my doors and windows. I started having nightmares about footsteps in the woods and waking up to someone standing outside my bedroom. I never went back to that cabin, and I never will. That week was supposed to be about peace and quiet, but the silence I found out there wasn't peaceful. It was the kind of silence that hides things. Things that move just outside your vision. Things that wait until the lights go out. And now, even in the city, that silence follows me. I'll be walking down the street at night, and I'll hear footsteps behind me. I'll turn around and no one will be there. But I know better now. Sometimes, when the world gets too quiet, I remember that feeling in the forest. That someone was out there with me, watching, waiting, and they were real. It was the middle of September when I decided to take a short break from work and spend a week alone in a cabin deep in the woods of northern Idaho. I was burned out from the constant noise of city life, the never-ending traffic, and the pressure of my job. I wanted complete isolation, no cell service, no internet, no people. Just me, the trees, the silence, and hopefully, some peace. The cabin belonged to a friend of a friend. He let me use it for free, telling me it hadn't been used in a while, but everything should still work. It was a simple one-room wooden structure with a small kitchen area, a cot with a thick sleeping bag, and a wood-burning stove in the corner. No electricity, no running water except for a hand pump outside that pulled water from a deep underground source. It was miles from the nearest paved road, and the dirt trail that led to it wasn't even marked on most maps. I parked my truck at the end of the trail and hiked in with a backpack full of supplies. It took almost 2 hours of steady walking to get there. By the time I arrived, I was sweating through my shirt and my legs were sore, but the air was clean, the forest quiet, and the cabin stood in a small clearing surrounded by towering pine trees. It felt like the right place to disappear for a while. The first 2 days were uneventful. I woke with the sunrise, made simple meals, read a book, and walked the area surrounding the cabin. The woods were thick and dark, with trees packed tightly together, making it easy to lose your sense of direction if you wandered too far. I marked trees with a pocket knife whenever I went more than a few hundred feet in, just to be safe. On the third day, I found something strange. I was walking east of the cabin, maybe half a mile in, when I noticed a small pile of rocks stacked in a very neat, narrow column. It was about 2 feet tall. At first, I thought maybe another hiker had built it, but this area wasn't on any trail system. Then I noticed another similar pile 20 feet away, and another, all in a straight line heading deeper into the woods. I followed them for a while but turned back when I realized I was much farther out than I planned to be. Something about the piles didn't sit right with me. That night I had trouble sleeping. The woods were louder than usual, more rustling, more distant cracking sounds like branches snapping. I told myself it was just animals, maybe a deer or two. Still, I got up and made sure the cabin door was latched and that my knife was within reach. The next morning, I went to fetch water from the pump outside. There were footprints in the dirt, barefoot, human-sized, and leading from the edge of the clearing right up to the pump. The ground was still damp from the rain 2 nights earlier, so the prints were clear. I knew they weren't mine. I had worn hiking boots every time I went out. These prints were fresh. I felt my stomach twist. I checked the clearing for anything else unusual but found nothing. I even walked to the edge of the trees and looked in, trying to see if anyone was watching. There was no one, just the still trees and the sound of wind in the branches. I spent most of that day sitting in the cabin with the door locked. I kept the knife close even though it felt stupid. Who was I expecting? A barefoot hiker with nothing better to do than creep around someone's cabin in the woods? That night, I barely slept. Every little sound outside made me jump. I kept imagining someone standing just beyond the tree line, watching me, listening. I kept the lantern burning longer than usual, but eventually, I had to turn it off and try to sleep. The next day, I debated packing up and hiking back to my truck, but part of me felt like I was overreacting. Maybe the footprints were old. Maybe someone else had been camping nearby and just passed through. I decided to stay one more night. I told myself I was being paranoid. Just before sunset, I walked to the edge of the clearing again. I wanted to prove to myself that nothing was out there. I followed the edge of the trees in a wide circle, looking for any sign of movement. That's when I found something that made my blood run cold. Hanging from a low branch was a dead squirrel. Its body was cut open, its inside scooped out and replaced with small pebbles and sticks. The whole thing was tied together with a piece of string and hung like an ornament. It was fresh. There were no bugs on it yet. I backed away slowly, eyes scanning the trees. I didn't see anyone, but I no longer felt alone. I went back to the cabin, locked the door, and pushed the small table in front of it. I didn't eat dinner. I just sat with my back against the far wall, holding my knife. The sun went down. The forest got quiet again. Too quiet. Around midnight, I heard footsteps outside. Slow, deliberate, crunching in the dry grass. They stopped just outside the door. I didn't move. I didn't even breathe. The footsteps moved again, slowly circling the cabin. I could hear them shift with the boards of the small porch, then move past the windows. I sat there for what felt like hours, heart pounding in my throat. Eventually, the sounds stopped. I waited until dawn before I dared to move again. The next morning, I stepped outside with the knife in one hand and a flashlight in the other. There were more barefoot prints, dozens of them, some large, some small. They weren't just around the pump anymore, they were everywhere. Around the cabin, behind the woodshed, even directly below the small window by the bed. I didn't hesitate this time. I packed up everything I could carry, shoved it into my backpack, and started the hike back to my truck. I moved fast, too fast, but I didn't care. I kept looking behind me every few minutes, half expecting to see someone following me. About a mile in, I realized I wasn't on the trail anymore. Somehow I'd gotten turned around. The trees all looked the same. I pulled out my map and compass and tried to reorient myself, but nothing was lining up. I couldn't find the creek that was supposed to run parallel to the trail. I couldn't even hear it. Panic started to creep in. I knew how dangerous it was to get lost out here. I took a deep breath, told myself to calm down, and picked a direction that should have led back to the road. I walked for hours. Nothing looked familiar. The sun was getting low again. Then I saw the cabin. I stared at it in disbelief. I had walked in a massive circle. Somehow I was back where I started. I didn't go inside. I didn't even go near it. I kept walking, trying again to find the right direction. I tried using the sun, tried everything I knew. But every path I took led me deeper into the woods. Every tree looked the same. Felt like I was being herded, pushed away from something, or toward something. That night I didn't sleep. I climbed a tree and sat in the branches, trying to stay above whatever was on the ground. I kept hearing the footsteps again. More than one set this time. Moving, waiting. At one point, I saw a figure, just a silhouette standing between two trees, too far to see clearly. I didn't move. Eventually, it disappeared. By the fourth day, I had almost no food left. I was dehydrated, exhausted, and starting to lose hope. My flashlight batteries were nearly dead, and I hadn't seen the sun in hours. The clouds had rolled in thick and low, covering everything in a dull gray. Late that afternoon, I heard something different. An engine, a low hum in the distance. I ran toward the sound, stumbling through the undergrowth until I burst out onto a narrow dirt service road. A utility truck was parked there. Two workers were inspecting a fallen tree that had taken down part of a power line. They looked up, surprised to see me. I must have looked like hell. I could barely speak. They gave me water, let me sit in the cab of the truck, and called it in. I didn't tell them everything, just that I'd gotten lost hiking. They drove me back to my truck. I thanked them 100 times. When I finally got back home, I didn't tell anyone the full story, not even my closest friends. I felt stupid, scared, and lucky all at once. But I couldn't stop thinking about those footprints, the dead squirrel, the figures in the woods. I looked at a satellite map a few weeks later. That cabin isn't there anymore. Not on any map. No clearing, no trail, nothing but dense forest. I haven't gone back. I never will. It was late October when I decided to take a break from the noise of the city. My work had been killing me slowly. I had dark circles under my eyes. My hands shook even when I wasn't tired, and I couldn't remember the last time I had eaten something that wasn't microwaved. So I rented a cabin deep in the mountains of northern Idaho. It was an old, single-story log cabin surrounded by dense trees on all sides, with a gravel road that twisted through the forest and ended right at the porch. It was perfect. Isolated, quiet, and just far enough from any real town that I wouldn't be bothered. The cabin had no Wi-Fi, no TV, and barely any phone signal. It had a fireplace, a decent kitchen, and a generator that kept the lights on and the fridge running. There was a small creek that ran nearby, and I could hear it clearly at night. Sounded peaceful. I brought a pile of books, some canned food, coffee, and just enough gear to make myself comfortable. I wanted nothing more than to shut the world out for a while. The first day went well. I unloaded my bags, got the fire going, and made a simple meal. The air was cold but crisp. I sat on the porch that evening, sipping hot coffee, watching the trees sway slightly in the wind. The cabin creaked a little as it settled, but it didn't bother me. I had expected that. Wooden buildings always make noise. It was just part of the atmosphere. But by the second night, I started feeling uneasy. Nothing major, just little things. I would hear a rustle out in the woods when the wind wasn't blowing. I told myself it was just animals. Deer maybe, squirrels. There were no lights around for miles, so when the sun went down, everything went pitch black. I had brought a flashlight, of course, and there were a couple of oil lamps in the cabin, but it was still unsettling how thick the darkness felt. I could feel it pressing in from the windows. By the third day, I started noticing something strange. I had gone out to chop some firewood that morning and found the axe missing. I always left it next to the stump out back, but it wasn't there. I looked around for it, thinking maybe I had absent-mindedly carried it back to the porch or left it inside. I searched the whole cabin, even under the bed and in the kitchen, but I couldn't find it. I ended up using a small handsaw I had brought, but it was slow work. That night, the air felt colder than it had the last 2 nights. I put an extra log in the fire and wrapped myself in a thick blanket. I tried to read but couldn't concentrate. My eyes kept drifting toward the windows. I felt like someone was watching me. Every now and then, I thought I saw movement in the dark outside. Just quick flashes, like something ducking behind a tree. But when I stared hard, I saw nothing. I told myself it was my imagination playing tricks on me. The 4th morning, I found the axe. It was sitting on the porch, covered in dirt. The handle looked wet, and there were small scratches near the blade, like it had been dragged across a rock. I hadn't used it since the first day. I didn't know how it had gotten back there, and I didn't like the idea that someone else had touched it. But I tried to shake it off. Maybe I had moved it and forgotten. Maybe I was just tired. But that day, I didn't feel right. I kept thinking about the axe. I kept looking toward the trees, listening for footsteps, trying to hear anything unusual over the sound of the creek and the wind. It was quiet, too quiet. There were no birds that morning, no squirrels running through the branches, just stillness. That night, I couldn't sleep. I lay in bed with the blanket pulled up to my chin, staring at the ceiling. The fire had died down, and the shadows in the cabin had grown longer. Around 2 in the morning, I heard something, a slow, dragging noise outside. Not footsteps, not anything quick or loud, just a long, drawn-out scrape, like something being pulled along the porch. I held my breath and listened. It stopped. Then it started again. I got up, slowly, and grabbed the flashlight. I didn't want to turn it on right away. I stood near the window, trying to peek outside without moving the curtain too much. I couldn't see anything, just black trees and the vague outline of the porch railing. I waited there, listening, barely breathing. The sound started again. This time it was closer to the window. I flicked on the flashlight and pointed it outside. Nothing, just empty porch and trees. But the noise had stopped. I didn't sleep after that. I sat by the fire until morning, feeding it every hour, keeping the light bright. When the sun came up, I stepped outside. I didn't see anything unusual at first, but then I noticed something strange on the side of the cabin. Long scratch marks low to the ground. They weren't from an animal. They looked deliberate. They were shallow but long, and they dragged in a straight line along the wood. I packed my things that afternoon. I didn't care if I still had 4 more days left. I had come for peace, and now I felt like I was being watched every second. I loaded up the car, double-checked all the windows and doors, and locked the cabin behind me. I drove down that narrow road as fast as I could without sliding off into the trees. But just before the road turned and the cabin vanished from view, I looked back, and I saw something standing at the edge of the woods. Not a person, not an animal, just a shape, still, watching. I didn't stop. I didn't slow down. I just drove. When I got home, I didn't tell anyone. What would I say? That I got scared in the woods? That someone moved my axe and scratched up the wall? Sounded stupid even to me, but I still have nightmares about that cabin. I still see the trees, the empty windows, the deep shadows, and I still remember the feeling of something standing just beyond the light. Sometimes I wonder what would have happened if I stayed just 1 more night. But I'm glad I didn't. I'm glad I left, because whatever was out there, it wasn't afraid of me. And I don't think it wanted me to leave, but I did, and I'm never going back. I was 34 when I decided I needed to get away for a while. Everything in my life had turned into noise. Work was constant pressure, the city was too loud, and I hadn't had a full night's sleep in months. One morning, after I spilled coffee on my shirt for the 3rd time in a week and snapped at a stranger on the train, I realized I was burning out. That same night, I booked a week-long stay at a remote cabin I found online. It was up in northern Minnesota, tucked between the edge of a lake and miles of pine forest. The place was cheap. Too cheap, honestly. But I didn't care. It was secluded, quiet, had electricity and a wood stove, and no internet or cell service. That was the point. I didn't even tell anyone where I was going. I just needed a break. I packed my car with some food, clothes, a knife, a flashlight, a heavy jacket, and a couple of books I'd been meaning to read. I left early in the morning, driving through the back roads for hours before I finally found the narrow dirt path leading into the woods. The road leading up to the cabin was rough and almost disappeared in some places. It was clear nobody had been through there in a while. Branches scratched the sides of my car, and I drove slow, bouncing over rocks and holes. By the time I reached the clearing where the cabin sat, the sun had already dropped behind the trees. Everything was quiet, too quiet. The cabin was small, built out of dark wood, with a sloped roof and a wide porch. It looked older than it did in the pictures online. The windows were covered in dust, and the front steps creaked under my weight as I climbed them. I unlocked the door using the code the owner had sent me and stepped inside. It smelled like old wood and dirt. There was a small kitchen to the left with a stove and sink, and to the right, a sitting area with a dusty couch and a wood-burning stove. Past that was a bedroom with a single bed and a narrow window. I flicked the light switch, and to my surprise, the bulb overhead came on. The power worked. I unpacked my things slowly, half listening to the sound of the wind outside. It was dead quiet. No traffic, no voices, not even birds. It was almost too silent, like the whole forest had stopped breathing. That first night was calm. I lit a fire in the stove, made some soup on the gas burner, and read until I got tired. I was asleep by 10, buried under a thick blanket. The bed was lumpy and cold, but I was so exhausted I barely noticed. The next morning, I woke up to snow. It had started overnight and now covered everything in a light layer. The trees looked like they were dusted with powdered sugar, and the lake beyond the trees had a thin sheet of ice forming over it. I made breakfast, walked around a little outside, and spent most of the day reading and napping. The peace felt good. My brain slowed down for the first time in months. That night, as I was locking the front door, I noticed something strange. There were footprints in the snow. They weren't mine. I had only gone out once, and I knew exactly where I walked. These were fresh and came from the tree line, circling the cabin. They were boot prints, large, deep ones. I stared at them for a while, trying to make sense of it. I figured maybe a hunter had passed by or someone lived nearby and was just walking through. Still, they were too close to the cabin, like someone had walked around it deliberately. I checked the back window and saw more prints leading away into the trees. I kept the stove burning hot that night and pulled the heavy knife from my pack, setting it on the table beside the bed. I didn't sleep well. By the third day, the prints had faded under more snow, but I couldn't stop thinking about them. I kept glancing out the windows, scanning the trees. I didn't see anything, but I felt watched, like the forest had eyes. I tried to shake it off. I told myself I was being paranoid, that the silence was getting to me, but I couldn't relax. That evening, just as it started getting dark, I heard something outside. At first, it sounded like branches snapping, but then it was heavier, like footsteps on dry leaves. I turned off the lights and stood by the window watching. I didn't see anything, but the sound kept coming and going, slow and steady. Something or someone was out there. I stayed up most of the night, sitting in the dark with the knife in my hand, listening. Around 3 in the morning, the sound stopped. In the morning, I found more prints. This time, they were closer, right up against the porch. Whoever it was had stood just outside my front door. There were marks in the snow like they had been pacing, maybe waiting. I checked the door for scratches or damage, but didn't find any. It was locked. Everything inside was untouched. I tried to leave that day. I packed up my things, grabbed my keys, and got in the car. But when I started the engine, nothing happened. Dead. The battery wasn't just low, it was gone. I tried again and again. No clicks, no lights. It was like the power had been drained. I opened the hood, checked the terminals, but nothing looked wrong. I had jumper cables, but no one to use them with. I was stuck. There was no cell signal. The nearest town was over 15 miles away, and the snow was coming down harder now. I could walk it maybe, but if I got lost or injured, I'd be screwed. So I stayed. I tried to calm myself, telling myself that maybe the battery just died from the cold. It happens. That night, I nailed a chair against the front door and dragged the couch in front of the window. I kept the fire going and sat by it, my eyes wide open. Around midnight, I heard the steps again. This time, they came right up to the wall. I could hear breathing, slow, heavy breathing just outside. Then there was a soft thud, like a hand or something pressing against the wood. It stayed there for minutes. I didn't move, then silence. The next day, I decided I needed to figure out what was going on. I bundled up, grabbed my knife, and followed the prints. They went around the cabin again, circled the back, and led off into the trees. I followed them for about a quarter mile, heart pounding, stepping slowly. The tracks finally stopped near an old tree stump, and that's when I saw it. A small campsite. There was a tarp, a few scattered cans, a burned-out fire pit, and some clothes hung from a low branch. Everything was filthy and wet. It looked like someone had been living there for a while, but it was empty now. I looked around for signs of recent activity. The snow near the tarp was disturbed. There were boot prints, same as before. I didn't stay long. I turned and hurried back to the cabin. That night, I heard something tapping on the window, slow, rhythmic taps. I didn't look. I didn't move. I just stared at the wall until the tapping stopped. The next morning, I found a dead rabbit nailed to the front door. Its body was stiff with frost, and its blood had frozen to the wood. It had no head. I lost it for a while. I sat on the floor, shaking, trying to figure out what to do. I thought about walking to town, but I knew I wouldn't make it in this weather. I was stuck. I stopped sleeping. I barely ate. I kept the fire going and stayed inside, pacing the floor, knife in hand. Then came the fifth night. That was the worst. Around 2 a.m., I heard the door handle jiggle. Not just once. Over and over, like someone was trying different angles, trying to turn it quietly. I stood frozen in the hallway, staring at the door. Then came scratching. Long, slow scratches down the wood, like a nail or a knife. It went on for nearly 30 minutes. Then it stopped. I didn't sleep at all. When the sun rose, I decided I wasn't going to die in that cabin. I packed my backpack, dressed in layers, and left a note saying I was heading for town in case someone found the place later. I followed the road back through the woods, keeping my knife out and my ears open. It took me almost 7 hours, but I finally saw power lines and eventually reached the edge of a small town. I stumbled into a gas station and collapsed. Someone called the sheriff. I told them everything. They drove back with me that afternoon. The cabin was empty. The prints were gone. The dead rabbit, the campsite, everything gone. The sheriff looked at me like I was exhausted and maybe crazy, but he didn't say anything. He towed my car, gave me a ride to a motel, and said he'd send someone to check the area more closely. 2 days later, he called me. They found a man living in an old hunting shack a few miles north of the cabin. He had a long record, trespassing, stalking, assault. He wasn't talking, but they found photos in his shack. Photos of the cabin, of me. Some were taken through the windows. That was enough. I never went back. I sold my car, quit my job, and moved back to the city. I started going to therapy. I changed my number. For a while, I jumped every time I heard a noise at night. I still checked the locks twice before I sleep. There were no ghosts, no demons, just a man. A real man living out there watching, waiting. And sometimes, I still dream of that slow tapping on the glass. It was early November when I decided to take a break from my job and spend some time alone in the woods. I had been working nonstop for over a year, and I felt completely burned out. My boss finally approved my request for 2 weeks off, and I didn't waste any time. I found a remote cabin online, deep in the mountains of northern Idaho. It was far from any town, had no Wi-Fi or cell service, and was surrounded by forest on all sides. The listing said it was perfect for people looking to disconnect. That was exactly what I needed. The drive up took most of the day. The The cabin was a good 6 hours from where I lived, and the last 2 hours were on winding, gravel roads that climbed steeply into the hills. I passed through thick forests, crossed a few narrow wooden bridges, and saw no other vehicles once I left the main road. By the time I pulled up to the cabin, the sun was already dropping behind the mountains. The cabin was small but sturdy. It had a stone foundation, wooden walls, a slanted tin roof, and a big porch that looked out over a valley. There was a fire pit out front, a shed to the side, and an outhouse around back. Inside it was simple, just a bed, a table, 2 chairs, a wood stove, and a few shelves. There was a propane lantern, a small sink that worked off a rain barrel system, and a solar panel that powered one outlet and a tiny fridge. No luxury, but enough to get by. I brought food, water, firewood, and enough supplies to last the full 2 weeks. I also brought a book, a journal, and my hunting rifle, not to hunt, but more for safety. There were bears and mountain lions in the area, and I wasn't planning on taking any chances. The first few days were exactly what I needed. I hiked during the day, cooked simple meals, and slept deeply every night. The quiet was like medicine. I didn't miss my phone. I didn't miss work. I didn't miss people. I saw deer almost every day, and once I saw a moose down by a creek. I didn't go near it. I just watched from a distance. I felt like I was slowly coming back to life. But around the 5th day, things started to feel a little strange. It started with small things. I noticed a footprint in the mud near the trail behind the cabin. Just one, off to the side. It was a boot print, not mine. I wear size 11. This one was much smaller. Maybe a woman's or a teenager's. I thought maybe someone else had come through the area, maybe a hiker or a hunter. But it still made me uneasy, especially since the print looked fresh and I hadn't heard anyone nearby. Later that day, I found a cigarette but near the fire pit. I don't smoke, and I hadn't seen one when I arrived. It wasn't old. It hadn't been rained on or stepped on. It was just there, as if someone had stood right where I was standing and smoked it while looking out over the valley. I felt a little paranoid that night. I checked the windows twice, made sure the door was locked, and kept my rifle close. But nothing happened. The next day, I tried to brush it off. Maybe the cabin had been used by someone else recently, and I just hadn't noticed before. Maybe they had left things behind. It didn't explain the fresh footprint, but I tried not to dwell on it. On the 7th day, I woke up early. It was still dark. I got dressed, made some coffee on the small propane stove, and stepped outside. There was frost on the porch and a thick fog down in the valley. I stood there sipping my coffee and listening to the silence. Then I saw something that made my stomach drop. There was a shape near the edge of the trees. Not an animal, person, just standing there. I froze. I couldn't see them clearly because of the fog, but I could tell they were facing me. I stood there staring, and they didn't move, not for several long seconds. Then, without any warning, they turned and walked back into the trees. I stood there for a minute, heart pounding. I grabbed my rifle, loaded it, and walked slowly to where I had seen the figure. There were no tracks, no sign of anyone. The ground was frosted, and I should have seen something. A footprint, a broken branch, anything. But it was like they had never been there. I spent most of that day on edge. I kept checking the windows. I barely ate. Every sound outside made me jump. That night, I barely slept. I kept the fire going, sat in the chair by the window, and watched the woods. The next morning, I found something that made it worse. It was a small bundle of sticks tied together with red string. It was sitting on the porch, right in front of the door. I hadn't heard anything during the night. Nothing had moved, but someone had walked right up to the cabin and left it there. I didn't know what it meant. I didn't want to know. I threw it into the fire and watched it burn. The string melted first, then the sticks cracked and turned black. That day, I hiked a few miles in every direction looking for any sign of who might be out there. I didn't find anything. No people, no tents, no vehicles, just forest and snow patches. When I got back to the cabin, I wrote everything down in my journal and considered cutting my trip short. That night, things got worse. I woke up around 2 in the morning. At first, I didn't know why. Then I heard it, a tapping, very light, from the back wall of the cabin. It wasn't wind. It wasn't an animal. It was steady and slow. I sat up in bed, heart racing, and listened. Stopped for a while. Then I heard it again, this time near the window. I grabbed the rifle, turned on the lantern, and slowly looked out the window. I didn't see anyone, but I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was just outside the edge of the light, watching me. I didn't sleep after that. I stayed up until the sun came up. As soon as there was light, I went outside to look around. There were faint tracks in the frost, circling the cabin. They weren't mine. They came from the woods, circled the building, and went back the way they came. I followed them as far as I could. They led about 50 yards into the trees and then disappeared. I packed up that morning. I didn't care if it meant leaving early. I had no way to call for help, and I didn't want to be alone out there anymore. Something was wrong, and I wasn't going to wait around to see how bad it could get. I loaded my truck and started down the road. I kept checking the rearview mirror the whole way. I expected to see someone step out of the woods, but I didn't. Just trees and empty road. I made it back to town by evening. I checked into a motel and finally felt safe. That night, I slept for 10 hours straight. When I woke up, I felt like I had just escaped something I couldn't quite explain. Not supernatural, not a ghost or anything like that. Just someone out there. Someone who knew I was alone. Someone who wanted me to know they were there. I didn't report anything. I didn't call the police. What would I say? That someone left a bundle of sticks on my porch and walked around my cabin at night? There was no proof, just my word. I never went back to that cabin. I don't even look at the woods the same way anymore. Something about being watched, about knowing someone was out there and choosing not to show themselves. It stuck with me. Now, whenever I think about taking another solo trip, I stop myself. It's not worth the risk. There are too many places out there where no one can hear you. Too many places where someone can hide in the trees and wait. And the worst part is you might never even see them, but they see you, and they know you're alone. I had never stayed alone in a cabin before. I'd done plenty of solo hikes and even spent nights in my tent miles away from anyone. But a cabin stay was new for me. It was early October, and I needed a break from the noise of the city and the stress that had been building up over the last few months. I booked a week-long stay in a small wooden cabin deep in the northern part of Minnesota, far from anything. No town for miles, just dense forest, winding dirt roads, and a cold lake beside the cabin that looked like glass when the wind died down. The cabin was old but solid, made from real logs, not the fake ones you see in the suburbs. There were only 2 rooms, one small bedroom and one larger main room with a couch, a table, a fireplace, and a kitchen counter along the wall. There was no Wi-Fi, no TV, and barely any cell signal unless I walked up a hill near the lake. I didn't care. That was the point. I wanted quiet. I wanted space. I wanted to be alone. When I first got there, it felt perfect. The leaves were turning orange and red, and the wind made them rustle like soft whispers in the trees. I could hear loons calling from the lake and the occasional creak of the cabin shifting when the wind picked up. There was a woodpile out back and a hatchet stuck into a tree stump. I even had a basic battery-powered radio, which I used just to check the weather. The first couple of days were peaceful. I woke up with the sun, went for walks through the trees, cooked simple meals on the propane stove, and read books I hadn't touched in years. It was cold at night, but the fireplace worked well, and the logs burned slow and steady once I figured out how to stack them right. I felt calm in a way I hadn't in years. My phone stayed off, and the only light after dark came from a lantern and the fire. But by the 4th day, something started to feel off. Not supernatural or anything, just strange, slightly wrong. Started small. I went for my usual morning walk. I followed a narrow path through the woods that looped back to the cabin. I knew the route. I'd walked it every day since I got there. But that morning, something had changed. About halfway through the loop, I noticed a spot in the trail that looked different. A part of the ground that had been covered in leaves was now clear, like someone had swept them aside. The dirt underneath was darker and soft, like it had just been disturbed. I crouched down and saw faint boot prints, fresh ones. Not mine. They were bigger and deeper. I hadn't seen another person since I'd arrived, and the cabin was far off any main road. I figured maybe a hunter passed through early in the morning, maybe looking for deer. Still, I kept looking over my shoulder the rest of the walk. I didn't see anyone, but I didn't enjoy the trail as much that day. When I got back to the cabin, I locked the door, which I normally didn't bother with during the day. I also closed the curtains, though I didn't really know why. It just felt safer. That night, I couldn't fall asleep easily. Every time the fire made a sharp pop or the wind shifted, I snapped awake. I told myself it was just my mind playing tricks, but I ended up staying up until after 2 a.m. just listening. It felt like the forest had grown eyes. The next day, I tried to forget about it. I drank some coffee, chopped more wood, and went down to the lake to skip stones. But something kept pulling my attention back to the woods. I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was out there, watching. I started walking the perimeter of the cabin more often, checking the windows, making sure the back door was locked. I told myself it was stupid, but I still did it. Later that afternoon, I walked up the hill by the lake to check for a signal. I hadn't planned to use my phone, but I wanted to check the weather in case a storm was coming in. I turned it on and waited while it searched for bars. 2 bars. Enough for a weather app. But I also noticed something else. 3 missed calls from an unknown number. Timestamps from around 3 a.m. No voicemail. No message. I turned the phone off and went back down the hill quickly, checking the woods more carefully than before. I didn't see anything, but I picked up the pace and got back to the cabin faster than usual. That night, I locked every door and window, pulled the curtains tight, and kept the fireplace going all night long. I moved one of the heavy chairs in front of the door, even though it felt paranoid. I tried to tell myself I was overreacting, that maybe the missed calls were robocalls and the footprints were from a hiker. Still, I slept with a knife by the bed that night. The next morning, I found something that changed everything. When I went to get firewood from the pile out back, I noticed that the hatchet was gone. I'd left it stuck in the stump like I always did, but now it was missing. I searched the area around it, thinking maybe it fell or I misremembered, but it was gone. I went inside immediately and locked the door. I pulled all the curtains again and sat there in the main room, staring at the fire. My chest felt tight and my stomach churned. I wasn't imagining things anymore. Someone had been here, close enough to take something, close enough to stand outside my cabin while I slept. I stayed inside the whole day. I didn't eat much, just stared out through a crack in the curtains, watching the woods for movement. I thought about leaving, but the car was parked out front, and to reach it, I'd have to step out into the open. The nearest ranger station was over an hour's drive away, and the only signal was halfway up the hill. If someone was watching the cabin, they'd see me go. That night, I didn't sleep at all. I kept the fire going and sat in the bedroom with the lantern on and the knife in my lap. I listened for every sound, every crunch of the leaves, every moan of the trees. It wasn't fear that kept me awake. It was something deeper, something like instinct. Around 4 a.m., I heard something. Not wind, not trees, footsteps, not fast, slow, careful, crunching leaves outside, one after another, then silence, then again, closer. I stood up and walked slowly to the main room, staying low. I peeked through the curtain, just barely. It was dark outside, but the moon was out, and it lit up part of the clearing in front of the cabin. I didn't see anyone at first. Then I did. A figure, at the edge of the tree line, tall, standing still, facing the cabin. I froze. My breath caught in my chest. I couldn't move. The figure didn't move either, just stood there, as if it knew I was looking right at it. Then it slowly stepped back into the trees and vanished. I stood there for what felt like an hour, barely blinking. When the sun started to rise, I finally moved again. I packed my things fast. I didn't care if I left stuff behind. I grabbed my keys and got to the car as quickly as I could. The woods were quiet, too quiet. I backed down the long dirt road, not caring if I scratched the car on branches. But the road didn't feel the same. Felt longer, more twisted. Then I saw it. A large fallen tree across the road. Fresh. The inside wood was still pale. It hadn't been there when I drove in. I got out, keeping the knife in my pocket. I tried to move it, but it was too big, too heavy. I had no chainsaw, no tools, just a hand axe which was gone. I looked around and listened. Nothing but wind. I thought about walking. It would take hours to get to the hill with signal, but it was better than staying. Then I noticed something carved into the tree bark near the break. Lines, 5 straight marks, like tally marks, freshly carved, deep. I didn't understand it at first, but I didn't need to. I ran back to the cabin. I had no choice. That day passed slowly. I kept the fire going and moved a heavy table against the back door. I stayed near the window with the clearest view of the front woods. My thoughts ran wild. Who was this person? Why were they doing this? What did they want? When night came, I turned off the lights and sat in the dark. I didn't see anything that night, but I didn't sleep either. At dawn, I tried something else. I found a flare gun in one of the emergency boxes the owner kept by the fireplace. I didn't think it would save me, but maybe it would signal someone if they were nearby. I walked to the edge of the clearing and fired it straight into the sky. It shot up with a red flash and a loud crack. I watched it burn out and fall. No response. No one came. But later that day, I found something else. A rope, tied tightly around one of the trees near the back of the cabin. It was long, stretched out toward the woods like a trip line, almost invisible unless you were looking for it. It was tied at ankle height. I cut it down and threw it in the fire. That night, the footsteps came back, circling the cabin. Slow, deliberate. I didn't look through the window this time. I didn't want to see whoever it was again. They didn't try to break in. Not yet. Just walked. I stayed up all night again. My eyes hurt. My hands were sore from gripping the knife too tight. My heart wouldn't slow down. I needed out. I needed help. As soon as the sun rose, I grabbed the flare gun again and headed for the hill. I walked fast, sticking to the trail, glancing over my shoulder every few minutes. I made it to the top and turned my phone on. It was late October when I decided to take a solo trip to a cabin in northern Montana. I had been working long weeks back to back and I needed a break. I didn't want to go somewhere busy or crowded. I just wanted complete silence. No phone calls, no emails, no traffic, nothing. I found a listing for a small off-grid cabin on a rental site. The photos showed an old wooden structure with a tin roof, surrounded by tall pines, tucked about 8 miles away from the nearest town. No Wi-Fi, no TV, just a fireplace, a cot, and an outhouse. I packed my Jeep with food, firewood, some tools, a water jug, a rifle, and my gear. The road leading to the cabin was rough and narrow, mostly dirt with some patches of loose gravel. There were barely any signs, and I relied on GPS until I lost signal around 5 miles out. From there, I followed handwritten instructions left by the cabin owner. It took a while, but eventually I found the turnoff, just a narrow path barely wide enough for the Jeep. It snaked uphill between trees that grew close together and cast long shadows even in the afternoon light. By the time I arrived at the cabin, the sun was beginning to drop behind the trees. The place looked even older in person. The wood was dark and weathered. The steps creaked when I walked up them, and the door stuck when I opened it. Inside, it smelled like old wood and smoke. There was a small table, a wood stove, a single cot with a thin mattress, and a small storage shelf. A few candles sat on the table beside a box of matches. I lit one and set it in the window while I brought my stuff inside. The first night was quiet. Too quiet, actually. When you live in a city, you get used to a low hum of sound. Cars in the distance, dogs barking, sirens, whatever. Out there was nothing. No wind, no birds. Just the sound of the fire cracking inside the stove and the occasional snap of a tree branch in the distance. I sat in the cabin, ate a can of chili, and read by candlelight. When I went to bed, it was hard to fall asleep. Every small sound felt sharp and sudden. I kept reaching for the rifle I had propped against the wall, just in case. The second day I spent outside. I chopped some wood, hiked around a bit, and tried to fish in the nearby stream. No luck. The air was colder than I expected, and it carried a smell of damp leaves and wet bark, the kind of cold that settles in your bones after a while. I built a bigger fire that night, ate better too, cooked some beans and rice on my camp stove. As I was cleaning up, I thought I heard something moving just outside. It was slow, like crunching leaves one step at a time. I froze. It stopped. I waited, rifle in hand, and stood by the door for a long time. Eventually, I opened it and looked around with my flashlight. Nothing, just woods and darkness. I chalked it up to an animal, probably a deer or maybe a fox. I tried to put it out of my mind. But later that night, when I was finally drifting off, I heard it again, closer this time. Not footsteps exactly, but something brushing against the cabin wall. It was a scraping sound, followed by silence. I sat up and held the rifle. My heart was beating faster now. I waited, listened. Nothing else happened. In the morning, I walked around the cabin to see if I could find tracks or signs of what made the noise. I did see something odd. Just behind the cabin, about 6 feet from the wall, the pine needles were disturbed. The ground was soft and it looked like something had stood there for a while. No clear tracks though, just patches where the needles were pushed aside. Could have been an animal. But then I noticed a deep scratch on the back wall. Just one. It looked like it was made with something metal, long, clean, and straight. That put me on edge. I spent the rest of the day closer to the cabin, collecting wood and listening. I didn't wander far. I kept the rifle nearby at all times. That night, I stayed up late with the fire going. Every time I heard something outside, I got up and checked. I didn't sleep much. On the 4th day, things escalated. I went to fetch water from the stream early in the morning and found something strange in the dirt by the bank. A footprint. It wasn't fresh, but it was big. Bigger than mine. Heavy. And there were others nearby, faint and scattered, like someone had been standing there and then moved off into the woods. I looked around but saw no one. That whole day, I felt like I was being watched. Every time I turned around, I expected to see someone. Every sound made my skin crawl. Even birds started to feel like they were warning me. I kept the fire going constantly, even during the day. I didn't want to be caught in the dark without light. That night, around 2 a.m., I heard something hit the side of the cabin, hard, like a rock or a fist. I jumped out of the cot and grabbed the rifle. Another hit, this time near the back wall. Then silence. I held my breath, listening. A minute passed. Then another sound. This time it was like someone dragging a stick across the outside wall. Slowly, deliberately, I stood frozen. My mind raced. I didn't want to shoot blindly into the dark, but I also didn't want to sit there and wait for something to happen. I opened the door just a crack and shined the flashlight out. The beam barely reached the trees. I saw nothing, but I heard something move. Quick, sharp. I shut the door, locked it, and dragged the table in front of it. I didn't sleep at all that night. In the morning, I found the back wall had fresh marks, several of them deep and long. There were small piles of broken pine needles around the cabin too, as if someone had paced in circles. I started to pack. I didn't want to spend another night there. By noon, I had everything in the Jeep. I was about to leave when I noticed something stuck to the tree at the edge of the clearing. It was a strip of fabric, torn and faded, looked like part of a jacket or a shirt. I didn't go near it. I got in the Jeep and drove. The road out was rougher than I remembered. At one point, I thought I heard something behind me, like a branch breaking. I kept checking the rearview mirror but saw nothing. I didn't stop until I hit pavement. I didn't report anything. I didn't call anyone. I just drove home. A few weeks later, I checked the listing for that cabin. It was gone. I emailed the site asking about it. No answer. I haven't been back to Montana since, and I never go camping alone anymore. I needed a break. That's how it started. I just needed to get away from all of it. Work, people, traffic, noise, just everything. It had been a rough few months. I was always tired, always anxious, like I was wired too tight and stretched too thin at the same time. I couldn't focus anymore. I'd wake up feeling like I hadn't even slept, just spinning inside my head. So I booked a week off work, turned off my phone notifications, and told myself I was going somewhere quiet, somewhere with no reception, no schedule, and no responsibilities. I found this cabin through a small rental site that focused on off-grid retreats. It was listed as a simple hunter's cabin up near the foothills of the northern part of the state, somewhere isolated, surrounded by forest and completely cut off. No cell service, no Wi-Fi, solar lights, wood-burning stove. It was perfect. The pictures showed a weathered wooden building in the trees with a metal roof, a small porch, and an old chimney that looked like it had seen dozens of winters. I booked 4 nights. I packed only what I needed. I kept it light but made sure I had the essentials. Food for 5 days, a sleeping bag, thick clothes, flashlight, batteries, a basic first aid kit, a knife, and a backup power bank. I brought a small camp stove too, just in case I didn't want to light the wood stove for every meal. I wasn't expecting luxury. I wanted quiet. I wanted stillness. I drove up on a Tuesday morning. The directions were old school. No GPS coordinates, just a turn-by-turn guide the owner had emailed. Once I left the last stretch of paved road, I followed a dirt trail for miles. No signs, no fences, just tall trees all around. The road got worse the deeper I went, narrower, bumpier, more washed out. Eventually, the road ended in a small clearing, and there it was, the cabin. It was just like the photos, a little bigger in person, but not by much. The trees crowded close around it, and there was a shed a few yards off to the right, half sunken and leaning. No cars, no people, just birds and wind. I stepped out of my car and took a deep breath. The air smelled like pine needles and cold dirt. I didn't hear a single engine or voice, just the wind shifting through the trees. The door was unlocked, just like the owner said it would be. I stepped inside and dropped my pack. The cabin had one room, a bed in the corner, a small table, a wood-burning stove, a dusty shelf with some old books, and a window that looked out into the forest. There was a little solar-powered lantern hanging from a hook, and it gave off just enough light to push back the shadows. The place smelled like dry wood and thyme. I smiled. This was exactly what I needed. The first night was quiet, cold, but I had layered up and brought a thick sleeping bag. I read for a bit, made some noodles on the camp stove, and crawled into bed early. I fell asleep listening to the wind and the occasional crack of branches outside. It took me a while to relax, but eventually, I drifted off. It was the second day when things started to feel different. I woke up with that strange feeling you get sometimes, like you're being watched. The cabin was dark inside, with only a little gray light coming through the window. I sat up and listened. Nothing, just wind. But that feeling wouldn't go away. I shook it off and went outside to stretch my legs. The forest was still, quiet in that heavy way that makes everything feel like it's holding its breath. I chalked it up to being alone and not used to the silence. I spent the day hiking around, following a narrow trail that looped through the woods. I didn't go far, just far enough to feel like I was away from everything. I saw deer tracks in the mud, a few squirrels, nothing strange. I came back around sunset and made a small fire in the ring out front. I ate in silence and watched the flames flicker. The shadows in the woods stretched out long and slow, and for a while, I lost myself in it. Then I heard it. It was quick. A rustle behind me, sharp, too fast for wind. I turned around, but I didn't see anything, just trees. Then again, another sound. Footsteps, crunching dry leaves. But when I stood up and stepped away from the fire, there was nothing. No movement, no animals running. I stood still and waited. Maybe a minute passed. Then I heard it again, this time farther to the left. Quieter, but steady. Something was walking around out there. I told myself it was just a deer, maybe a raccoon. I forced myself to ignore it and went inside. I locked the door, not that the old bolt would do much, and turned on the lantern. I stayed up for hours, just sitting in bed with my ears tuned to every noise. I didn't sleep much that night. The next morning, I stepped outside and checked around the cabin. I didn't see anything unusual, but I couldn't stop thinking about those footsteps. The ground was too covered in pine needles and soft dirt to make out tracks. I kept looking over my shoulder all day. That third night was worse. It started with tapping, like barely there, like a branch brushing the wall. But it kept happening. Not in the same spot. First by the front window, then near the sidewall, then again near the back of the cabin. Too steady for the wind, too slow. I killed the lantern and sat in the dark, heart pounding. The tapping stopped, then silence, then a loud thump right against the back wall. I jumped. My skin went cold. I grabbed my flashlight, flicked it on, and pointed it at the wall. But of course, I couldn't see anything. I waited. Then another sound like dragging, something scraping wood. Then silence again. I didn't go outside. I stayed up all night with the flashlight clutched in my hand, staring at the door. At some point, I must have dozed off, because I woke up in the morning with a sore neck and a dead flashlight. The sun was up, but it was overcast and gray. The cabin felt cold, even with my layers. I stepped outside and walked around the cabin again. This time, I found something. On the far side of the cabin, down near the base of the wall, the wood was scratched. Long, deep lines, like something with nails had clawed it, or dragged something heavy across it. The marks were fresh. The wood was pale and raw. I told myself maybe it was an animal, a bear maybe, but the marks weren't wide enough. And they weren't high up. They were low, too low, like something crouched had done it. That day, I kept close to the cabin. I started hearing things again. Distant snapping branches, short bursts of movement in the woods. Not constant, but just enough to keep my nerves frayed. Every time I stepped inside, I felt like something was out there watching me. I made a decision then. I was gonna leave a day early. I didn't care about the money. I just wanted out. But that night, I learned I'd waited too long. It started just after dark. I was packing up my things, shoving gear into my backpack. I had already decided I'd leave before first light. I didn't care if I had to hike in the dark. I just wanted to be gone. That's when I heard the door rattle. Not the wind. The handle actually turned. It jiggled softly, then again, harder this time, then silence. I didn't move. I just stared at the door. My heartbeat was thudding in my ears. I backed away slowly and grabbed the knife from my pack. I didn't even breathe. Then came a knock. Not a loud one, but deliberate, slow. 3 knocks, then nothing. I couldn't move. I didn't know what to do. Then I heard footsteps. Slow, walking along the porch, then down the steps. The boards creaked under the weight. Then something moved past the side window. A shadow, then gone. I stayed awake the entire night, crouched by the door with the knife in one hand and my dead flashlight in the other. I didn't hear anything else. No more knocks, no footsteps, just silence. That made it worse. I felt like I was being hunted, like whatever was out there was waiting for me to let my guard down. As soon as the sky started to lighten, I grabbed my pack and quietly opened the door. The porch was empty. The forest looked calm. But I knew better. I kept my knife in one hand and moved fast. I didn't stop to look back. I just walked straight toward the car. When I got to the clearing, my heart dropped. The car doors were open. All of them. The trunk was up, too. My back seat had been torn apart, sliced like with a knife. My spare gear was scattered across the ground. The driver's seat had deep gouges in it, as if someone had dragged something sharp across it again and again. The inside smelled like sweat and something rotten. I didn't wait. I threw my bag in and slammed the doors. I jumped in and turned the key. The engine coughed, then died. I tried again. Same thing. Again. Again. It wouldn't start. I was stranded. I grabbed my pack and ran. I didn't follow the road. I cut through the woods, trying to move fast and quiet. I kept hearing things around me, not close, but not far. Snapping twigs, breathing. Once I thought I saw something move between the trees, low to the ground. Fast. I don't know how long I walked. It started when I finally decided to take some time off from work. I had been working straight for nearly 10 months without a proper break. Burnout hit me hard. I was tired, stressed, and needed to disconnect. I booked a remote cabin deep in the northern woods of Idaho. No cell service, no internet, and no neighbors within a mile. It seemed like the perfect escape. Just nature, peace, and quiet. The cabin was basic, just the way I wanted it. One bedroom, a small kitchen, a bathroom, and a living room with an old wood stove. The nearest town was over an hour away. The forest surrounding it was thick, mostly pine and birch. There was a narrow dirt road that led to the cabin, and after a certain point, it was barely wide enough for my truck. I arrived in the late afternoon, unloaded my bags, and locked the truck. I stood for a while outside the cabin, just listening. No traffic, no voices, no buzzing of electronics. Just the wind moving through the trees and a few birds calling out. The first 2 days went by peacefully. I spent most of my time reading, cooking simple meals, and hiking the nearby trails. There were a few animal tracks near the cabin, mostly deer and what I guessed were raccoon prints. Nothing unusual. I had brought enough firewood for the week, so I kept the stove going whenever it got chilly. On the third night, I woke up to a strange sound. At first, I thought it was just branches scraping against the window, but when I listened more closely, it sounded like a light tapping, like someone drumming their fingers slowly on glass. I stayed still and kept listening. It wasn't constant, just a few taps, then silence. Pause, then another round of tapping. I got up, grabbed the flashlight from the bedside table, and walked over to the window. Nothing, just darkness and trees. I shined the flashlight around, but the beam couldn't cut through the dense woods beyond a few feet. I figured it might have been a bird or a branch swaying in the wind. I went back to bed, but the next night it happened again. Same pattern.
Top, purse, top.
Only this time, the sound came from a different window, and it was louder. I didn't sleep well after that. Every small sound made me alert. I started noticing other things too. Small things out of place. A chair slightly moved. The back door screen slightly ajar when I was sure I had latched it. Footprints in the mud near the back entrance that didn't match my boots. I kept trying to explain it away. Maybe I forgot to lock the screen. Maybe I moved the chair and didn't remember. But on the fifth night, things escalated. I had gone to bed early, exhausted from a long hike. Sometime around 2 or 3 in the morning, I was jolted awake by a loud noise. A thud came from the kitchen. I stayed in bed, holding my breath. Another thud followed. Then the sound of something metallic falling. I got out of bed slowly, picked up the hatchet I had kept near the stove, and crept toward the kitchen. All the cabinet doors were open. A few pots had fallen on the floor. The back door was wide open. I was certain I had locked it before sleeping. I walked outside with the flashlight, scanning the area around the cabin. Nothing. No animals. No signs of anyone. But I saw the footprints again. Clear in the mud. Barefoot. Human. The next morning, I decided to pack up and leave early. I didn't feel safe. I loaded most of my gear back into the truck. I planned to stay one last night, then leave at dawn. I double-checked every lock, blocked the back door with a chair, and even set up some empty tin cans on a string by the windows to make noise if they were opened. That night, I didn't sleep. I stayed on the couch with the hatchet and a flashlight, listening. Around midnight, the tin cans rattled. I turned off the flashlight and waited. Then I saw movement by the window. A figure crouched low, trying to peer in. I couldn't see the face, but I could make out the outline. Thin, barefoot, wearing what looked like torn clothes. They stayed there for almost a minute before moving out of view. I waited a few more minutes, then rushed to the bedroom, grabbed the last of my things, and left the cabin. I didn't care that it was pitch black outside or that the road was rough. I drove, fast but careful, watching the trees as I passed. I didn't stop until I reached the highway. I didn't call the police. What would I say? That someone was tapping on my windows and walking barefoot in the woods? There was no proof. Nothing stolen. No physical harm. I just never went back to that cabin. Later, I looked into the area and found out a few hikers had gone missing over the years. Some were found. Some weren't. The forest was thick and easy to get lost in. But a part of me wonders if they ever saw what I saw. Heard the tapping. noticed the footprints, or if they waited too long to leave. I still go out into the woods sometimes, but never alone, and never without a way to call for help. That week taught me that even in the most peaceful places, there are things, people, that can turn your escape into something you never forget.